In the waning light of a day that seemed to stretch across an endless desert sky, travelers moved through the shifting dunes with slow determination. They were pilgrims and wanderers, people from across the many corners of a vast land who had heard whisperings of a man named Magomed. Whispers that he spoke truths gleaned from the Qur'an, citing Surah 447, a verse that implored those who had received guidance to not turn away from the truth. The winds carried his name, and in these echoes they felt the possibility of revelations echoing from centuries past, reminding them of the Prophet Muhammad's call to unity and compassion. No one knew precisely when the rumors had begun. Some said that a traveling scholar had encountered Magomed in the middle of a parched marketplace. Others claimed that he was an ordinary villager who had glimpsed an angel in a dream. Yet, the notion that he embodied a message against the aversion to truth was enough to send caravans drifting in his direction. Men and women, young and old, found themselves drawn to the swirling tales of how he quoted the Qur'an not for ostentation but to mirror in humankind's heart the reflection of divine sincerity. Some nights, when the skies were so clear that the stars felt like watchful companions, people sat around campfires and spoke about what they expected to hear from this elusive figure. Would he recite Surah 447 word for word? Would he interpret it with fresh eyes, or would he simply retell a parable from the time of the prophet, hoping those gathered would glean from it their own lesson? But Magomed's story did not begin in that desert. It began in a small coastal town where the ocean waves crashed against the rocks with steady percussion. He was the third son of a fisherman, never intended for anything more than learning to mend nets and set sail in modest boats that puttered out to sea. His family was devout, waking each day with prayer on their lips, turning their hearts toward the Kaaba, mindful of the blessings and the burdens that life bestowed. Magomed learned early that truth was a luminous gift, one that could be embraced or shunned. He had asked his father once why so many people seemed to willfully ignore the clear words of the Qur'an. His father had only smiled sadly and answered that the heart is fickle. When it's hungry, his father said, it yearns for answers. But when it's full of comfort, it fears the truth might topple that comfort. Perhaps that is why Surah 447 warns those who have received the scripture, warns them to believe, to remain faithful, and not to drown in false illusions. Growing up in that seaside town, Magomed was known for his gentleness. His kindness was measured not by grand gestures but by the sincerity in his eyes when he offered help to the needy. If a neighbor lacked flour, he brought some from his own cupboard. If another's fishing boat was worn, he spent hours patching it with tar. He grew, day by day, absorbing the Quranic verses and pondering their deeper resonances. He learned from wise travelers, Sufis who spoke cryptic yet comforting wisdom about the unity of creation and the ephemeral nature of earthly attachments. He listened to the imam in the local masjid who taught that real devotion to Islam meant not just performing external rites, but letting the divine call shape your moral fiber until every breath, every step, radiated compassion. Still, something stirred in Magomed's soul, a restlessness that prompted him to leave that quiet coastal village when he came of age. He journeyed across mountains and plains, experiencing the tapestry of cultures that made up this broad land. He found that, while the call to prayer echoed from different minarets, the hearts of believers often struggled with the same aversion to truth that Surah 447 addressed. People were proud, they clung to old biases and ephemeral illusions, and they bristled when confronted with words that asked them to reassess their lives. He saw wealthy merchants who gave alms just to polish their reputations, and he saw priests who spoke holy words but harbored cruel intentions in secret. Yet, he also encountered pure souls who took in the orphan, who fed the hungry, who recited the words of the Qur'an as tears welled in their eyes, truly mindful of the presence of God. Eventually, Magomed's wanderings took him to a bustling city with towering spires and labyrinthine alleyways. There he discovered an undercurrent of discontent and cynicism. Many of the city's inhabitants had grown jaded. Some had once believed deeply in the words of the prophet and the teachings of the Qur'an, but now they questioned everything, suspecting that truth was just a manipulative tool used by those in power. Magomed found a small, modest lodging near a market where he sat for hours beneath a worn awning, quietly observing the bustle of commerce and human drama. Occasionally, he would speak to passers-by, asking them if they had read the scripture recently. Often, they would laugh or shake their heads, explaining that they were too busy. Sometimes, they claimed they no longer felt that spiritual connection, as though the truth had grown stale and irrelevant. In response, Magomed would recite a few lines, careful, gentle lines, from Surah 447. He offered them as though inviting the listener to rediscover an old friend, not to scold them. Yet, even these softly spoken words sometimes provoked anger or mocking dismissal. It was as if the mention of a truth they had once loved now pricked at their conscience, stirring guilt or defiance. In that city, Magomed's name began to surface in whispered conversations. Some said he was merely a naive wanderer, quoting the Qur'an without understanding the complexities of the modern world. Others insisted that his voice carried the weight of authenticity that their hearts longed for, the way a desert traveler yearns for water. Gradually, a small circle of seekers gravitated around him. They were hungry for what he might reveal, a path back to sincerity, to the essence of Islam that seemed buried under layers of habit and cynicism. Yet, just as the circle of seekers grew, so did the opposition. Traders in the marketplace worried that a renewed sense of moral accountability might disrupt their unscrupulous dealings. City officials, too, cast suspicious eyes on the gatherings, concerned that any stirring of deeply personal faith might undermine their authority. A subtle tension settled over the narrow streets and bustling corners as though the air itself crackled with the possibility of conflict. Some nights, Magomed stood at the heart of an old courtyard with crumbling walls. Candles flickered around him, placed by those who sought guidance in the darkness. There he spoke in a soft voice, reading from the Qur'an. He explained how Surah 447 wasn't just a condemnation of those who had strayed, it was a merciful reminder that the path of truth remained open for anyone willing to return to it. Do not be like those who were given the book before, he would recite, yet turned away as though deaf. For if you do not heed, a stern punishment may come. Then he'd pause and smile gently, adding, but the mercy of the most merciful is vast. Even if we have turned away 1,000 times, we may still turn back. Those who listened felt a longing awaken in them, a longing for a faith that was genuine, not hollow. They felt stirred by the idea that truth, once recognized, should not be abandoned. But others felt threatened. Whispers traveled through shadowy corridors that Magomed was sowing dissent, that he was stirring up illusions of spiritual renewal which could lead people to reject the authority of established leaders. It wasn't long before rumors of a conspiracy took hold, the seeds of fear scattering among the city's elite. Many recalled how the Prophet Muhammad had faced persecution in the early days of Islam for preaching unity and truth that threatened entrenched tribal structures. Now, in a different era, Magomed's gentle voice seemed to evoke the same unsettled reaction in the hearts of those who preferred the status quo. One evening, as the sky turned crimson, a group of stern-faced men approached Magomed in the courtyard. They confronted him, demanding to know who had given him the right to interpret the Qur'an publicly. He responded calmly, stating that the words of God belonged to all humankind, that the Prophet had encouraged the faithful to contemplate and understand the revelation. Islam does not belong to a few, he said quietly, it belongs to every heart that believes there is no God but God. And it is the heart that must decide whether to heed the truth or flee from it. The men scoffed. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward and declared in a loud voice that Magomed was misleading the people. He insisted that only the officially sanctioned clergy possessed the authority to interpret the Qur'an. Magomed listened respectfully and then answered, I do not claim to have authority. I only share what has touched my soul. And Surah 447 reminds us all not to turn away from the truth once it has reached us. Their anger boiled over. Another man jabbed a finger at Magomed's chest, sneering, you speak of truth as if you own it. Yet you are just a vagabond. Why should we heed you at all? At that moment, a few of Magomed's followers, previously standing in the background, stepped forward in alarm. But Magomed raised a hand to calm them. Brother, he said to his accuser, this truth does not belong to me. It belongs to the one who created all souls. I am just a messenger of something that has been revealed to all of us. The Qur'an itself says that if we persist in denial, we only harm ourselves. I pray that you do not let your pride or your comfort blind you to that. The tall man glared, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, as though a faint chord had been struck in his conscience. Then, muttering under his breath, he turned and stormed away. The others followed, leaving the courtyard in a tense hush. Magomed's small circle of followers exhaled, relieved that the confrontation had not escalated further. From then on, the city's tension deepened. Some worshippers came to Magomed privately, thanking him for reigniting their faith. They confessed that they had grown weary, that the daily grind of life in the city had hardened their hearts to spiritual truths. They admitted that Surah 447 had seemed like a relic from another time, no longer relevant to their struggles. But hearing it again in Magomed's voice stirred something in them, reminding them that the call to faith, to honesty, to moral integrity was a living thing, never confined to a single era. Meanwhile, resentment smoldered in others who felt threatened by the idea that the common people could interpret the Qur'an's message. Accusations began to swirl that Magomed was a fanatic, or worse, that he was inciting rebellion. Street corners buzzed with speculation. Was he truly guided by a sincere love for Islam, or was he a clever manipulator using religion to gain a following? The question lingered, and it turned the city into a hotbed of debate. In the midst of this turmoil, Magomed remained as he had been, unassuming, quiet in his daily habits, unwavering in his conviction that the words of the Qur'an were meant to free hearts, not chain them. He spent his afternoons guiding travelers who wished to learn more, always encouraging them to read on their own, to reflect deeply on the meaning of the verses. "It's not enough to hear it from me," he would say. "Your soul has its own conversation with the Qur'an. Let it speak." And so, as word spread of Magomed's presence, people from outside the city began to arrive. Caravans came from distant villages, bearing men and women who had heard that there was a man reciting scripture in a way that resonated with the soul's longing for truth. They crowded the courtyard until it could no longer contain them all, and soon the gathering spilled out onto adjacent streets. Lamps and torches lit up the night, a makeshift glow that illuminated faces filled with curiosity and the hope that they, too, could find a path back to a faith uncorrupted by pride or fear. But in the darkness of those alleys, forces gathered that saw this phenomenon as a threat. City officials, powerful merchants, and envious religious authorities convened in secret to discuss how they might subdue this wave before it overtook their carefully managed structures. They resented Magomed's message because it was simple, honest, and dangerously appealing. It reminded them of the early days of Islam, of the Prophet's radical call that upset the old hierarchies. If people truly believed, if they let go of their aversion to truth, what might they demand of those in power? Thus, the seeds of a grand conflict were sown. And Magomed, though aware of the looming opposition, continued with unwavering calm. In the reflection of his nightly prayer, he felt certain that the path he trod was righteous. For he remembered the words of Surah 447, and he believed that no matter how dark the horizon might appear, the light of truth could break through if even one heart remained open to it. Magomed spent his days in quiet dedication, often rising before dawn to offer his prayers in solitude. He would stand on the roof of his modest lodging, the muffled hum of the slumbering city stretching out below him, and let his heart seek the presence of the divine. In these intimate hours, he remembered the Prophet Muhammad's teaching that within the silence of early morning, a soul might best hear the echoes of truth. Sometimes the softness of the wind on his cheek felt like a reassuring hand, as though creation itself was whispering, "Carry on." Those closest to him, an assortment of travelers, townspeople who had once been skeptics, and a few deeply faithful souls, noticed that Magomed's demeanor, though calm, had grown more intent. Something in his eyes, a determined spark, hinted that he sensed a new urgency in his mission. He had never presumed to be a savior nor a prophet. He identified only as a man who believed in the Qur'an, who saw in Surah 447 a.m. cautionary note that could deliver humankind from the stubborn refusal to embrace truth. But as the crowds thickened and the voices of dissent grew louder, it seemed that the parable of his life was reaching a dramatic turning point. The courtyard where he had once spoken freely under candlelight soon became too cramped. During the day, merchants complained of the foot traffic blocking their stalls, while at night, neighbors warned that too many torches and oil lamps were a fire hazard. Some of the city's elders insisted on a formal gathering place, a space that could contain these assemblies without causing a daily uproar. Ironically, the only venue large enough was a dilapidated amphitheater built during a previous era. Its stone arches and wide, crumbling steps bore witness to years of disuse. Yet, when Magomed stepped into the center of that echoing space, he felt a tug at his spirit, as if those ancient stones vibrated with the memory of countless voices that had once filled the air with their pleas and proclamations. Volunteers spent days sweeping out the amphitheater, removing rubble and debris. Some said it was a symbolic gesture, that the city was cleaning out the cobwebs of its own conscience. Others joked more cynically that all they were doing was providing the city's officials a more visible target. Either way, the place sparkled with fresh possibility when the first assembly gathered. People trickled in at dusk, climbing onto those weathered stone seats, some leaning against columns, others carefully finding corners where they could listen without being jostled. And in the fading sunlight, Magomed stood before them with neither notes nor podium, just his voice, his conviction, and a heart that yearned to share what he believed was a sacred obligation. He began with a recitation of Surah 447, the verse he had carried like a guiding star through all his travels. His voice rose and fell in the melodic ebb and flow of Quranic Arabic. Many listeners did not fully understand every word in Arabic, but they felt the weight of its cadence resonate in their chests. Then Magomed offered a translation and reflection in the local tongue, gently elucidating the warning against turning away from the truth once it has been revealed. He spoke of how truth was not just a lofty ideal or a strict moral code, but a living presence in one's day-to-day life. "We are all custodians of the reality God has placed before us," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "We may ignore it, twist it, or bury it under our comforts, but in the end it remains." Surah 447 warns those who have been given knowledge not to behave as though they are deaf or blind. And yet, how often do we shut our eyes to injustice or deafen our ears to the cries of the hungry? How easily do we forget the unity that Islam teaches us, the unity of all believers, all creation, under the single truth that there is no God but God. A hush fell over the audience. Some found themselves recalling small moral compromises they had made, times they had turned away when they might have helped a neighbor or corrected a wrong. Others, particularly those who were younger, felt a flicker of inspiration light up their minds. They had grown up in a city overshadowed by cynicism, where hypocrisy often seemed more common than genuine goodness. Yet here was a man speaking of faith as something alive, something that demanded earnest self-examination and the courage to do what was right. For them, it was like tasting water after a long thirst. Word of these gatherings spread beyond the city. Nomads brought news back to their desert camps. Merchants carried the story to distant ports. The name Magomed began to invoke a sense of awakening, a possibility that maybe, just maybe, their hearts could still be stirred by the call of truth. Newcomers arrived each evening, adding to the sense of a growing, uncontainable phenomenon. But with expansion came heightened fears among the city's leadership. A group of powerful men, representing both religious and secular authority, convened in a marble hall beneath towering frescoes that depicted legendary conquests from centuries past. The governor of the city sat at the head of an ornate table, his expression stern. The chief cleric, robed in resplendent colors, sat beside him. Both had grown wary of Magomed's influence. Their advisors whispered that this man's popularity threatened to undermine the established hierarchy. If the people believed they could interpret the Qur'an for themselves, who would pay homage or taxes to the institutions that had always declared themselves the guardians of truth? The governor tapped his fingers on the table, echoing through the silent hall. "What we have," he said, "is not just a man reciting scripture. We have a potential rabble-rouser. Already, I hear the merchants complaining about disruptions. We cannot allow civil unrest." The chief cleric shifted uneasily. He was not fully comfortable with labeling Magomed a threat. There was a sincerity in Magomed's words that even the cleric, in his moments of honesty, found moving. But he was also keenly aware of his position. "His gatherings draw thousands," he acknowledged, "and he interprets Surah 447 in a way that speaks directly to everyday life, to the conscience of each person. Is that not a dangerous thing, Your Excellency? People might abandon the more traditional forms of worship, ignoring the established leadership in favor of his unconventional approach." A murmur of agreement rippled around the table. Some of the officials were wealthy merchants themselves, who had thrived under a predictable system of regulations. Any movement that awakened people to question moral integrity could upend their comfortable existence. Others were purely concerned about public order, recalling how easily large crowds can turn into angry mobs if properly provoked. "Perhaps we should speak with him directly," suggested a voice from the corner, one of the younger scribes, who had a reputation for fairness. "We cannot assume his intent is to incite rebellion." The governor turned a glare on the young scribe. "You speak as though we owe him courtesy, but it is he who should be seeking permission from us. Still, it might be wise to confront him in a more formal way." An agreement formed. A small delegation would approach Magomed, demanding that he register his teachings, that he comply with the recognized authority on religious matters, and that he refrain from stirring the populace into a fervor. If he refused, they would look for grounds to silence him, perhaps even arrest him. They called it a preventive measure. Meanwhile, Magomed continued to fill the amphitheater with his steady, reflective voice. He did not issue calls for violent upheaval or grand political statements. Instead, he invited listeners to look inward, to measure their lives against the moral scale outlined in the Qur'an and exemplified by the Prophet. He cited examples from Islamic tradition. The generosity of the Ansar in Medina who welcomed the Prophet and his followers with open arms, or the resilience of the early Muslims who faced persecution yet did not compromise their sincerity. His tone remained humble, never bombastic, and yet the effect was profound. People walked away with tears in their eyes or a renewed determination to do right by their fellow beings. "You see," Magomed would say quietly in conversation with individuals who lingered after the gatherings, "the real miracle is not that I speak these words. They have always been there in the Qur'an, accessible to anyone who seeks. The real miracle is what happens when a heart decides to truly listen." Those words, repeated in different forms, became something of a refrain among the city's populace. Some repeated them admiringly, finding hope in the notion that they did not need an intermediary to experience the divine. Others scoffed that Magomed was eroding the respect owed to religious scholars who had spent lifetimes mastering commentary. And among the small but powerful group who felt threatened by his influence, the refrain was twisted into an accusation of arrogance. Who does he think he is, telling people that scholarship and tradition are unnecessary? Of course, Magomed had never claimed such a thing. But fear and rumor have a way of distorting even the clearest messages. At last, the governor's delegation confronted him in broad daylight. It happened in the market square, where Magomed had gone to purchase some simple provisions: a bit of bread, fresh fruit, and clean water. He was accompanied by a few close companions, but no large crowd. This was precisely why the authorities had chosen the moment. They wanted him away from the throngs of supporters. There, beneath a blazing sun, a stern official stepped forward and blocked Magomed's path. "You are required," he announced loudly, "to present yourself at the Hall of Assembly tomorrow morning. The city's leadership seeks answers about your teachings and your gatherings." Magomed looked at the man without hostility, though his heart sensed the undercurrent of threat. "I will come," he said simply, "but know that I have never sought to hide or obscure my words. All are welcome at the amphitheater to hear what I say." The official snorted. "This is not a matter of voluntary invitation. It is a summons. Compliance is expected." Word spread quickly that Magomed had been ordered to appear before the city's leadership. Curiosity swelled among the populace. Some hoped that open dialogue might quell the tension. Others feared a trap. When dawn broke the next day, a crowd had already gathered in the streets leading to the Hall of Assembly. Even those who had once mocked Magomed felt compelled to watch what might unfold. Guards with polished spears and stern faces lined the broad marble steps that led up to the hall's arched entrance. They eyed the gathering multitude warily, prepared to enforce order if necessary. Magomed arrived on foot, dressed in the same plain garments he always wore, neither shabby nor ostentatious, but marked by the dust of long travels. He walked calmly through the parted crowd, acknowledging those who bowed their heads in respect. A mother gently touched his arm as he passed, a silent plea in her eyes as if to say, "Please, be careful." Magomed gave her a slight nod of reassurance. Inside, the Hall of Assembly was shaped like a grand rectangle, with tall pillars supporting a domed ceiling. The space echoed with hushed voices and the shuffling of feet. At one end sat a raised platform, behind which the governor and chief cleric waited, flanked by other high-ranking officials. Rows of seats fanned out before them, mostly occupied by members of the city's ruling council and a handful of notable citizens. The public was not allowed inside for the proceedings. Only those of certain standing or invited guests could witness what would transpire. Magomed stood in the open space before the platform, alone. One of the clerics cleared his throat and began, "Magomed, son of the fisherman from the coastal town, you have held gatherings in our city. You speak on matters of religion, interpret the Qur'an, and recite Surah 447 to the crowds. It has come to our attention that your words have stirred the people. We must ask, by what authority do you offer these teachings?" Magomed's voice, though gentle, carried well in the cavernous hall. I claim no authority other than that which God has granted all believers, the duty to bear witness to the truth. The Qur'an is the inheritance of all Muslims, indeed of all humanity. Islam does not lock itself in ivory towers. It calls each of us to reflect, to understand, and to act upon the guidance it offers. A faint ripple of murmurs spread through the assembly. The younger scribe who had earlier proposed a fair approach listened intently, appearing impressed by the simplicity of Magomed's answer. The governor leaned forward. That may be so, but we have structures and traditions for a reason. The common people might be misled by personal interpretations. Religious matters, especially those pertaining to law and morality, are best handled by recognized scholars, not by itinerant preachers who show up in our city and gather throngs of followers. Magomed held the governor's gaze respectfully. I have studied under various teachers in my journeys. I have listened to imams, to Sufis, to those who live Islam quietly in their daily deeds. My intent is not to replace scholarship but to remind people that they, too, have a responsibility to engage with the teachings. Surah 447 warns against turning away. If we rely solely on others to interpret God's word while we remain passive, are we not, in a way, turning away ourselves? A council member, visibly agitated, spoke up. And yet your gatherings have caused disruption. Markets are crowded, local authorities complain of the noise, and rumors abound of rebellious talk. Are you denying that your influence has contributed to civic unrest? Magomed spread his hands. I do not advocate rebellion. I only advocate the truth as taught by Islam. If people feel unsettled, perhaps it is because they sense the need for moral alignment in their lives. Surely, seeking righteousness should not be deemed a threat to the city. I urge everyone to remain peaceful, to respect the well-being of their neighbors. But I cannot stop their hearts from yearning for what is right. The chief cleric, who had until then observed in thoughtful silence, leaned in. His voice, though authoritative, held a nuance of genuine inquiry. Magomed, the verse you keep citing, Surah 447, speaks specifically to those given the scripture, urging them not to deny what has been revealed. Are you implying that many in the city, or in the broader community, are in denial of divine revelation? Magomed responded carefully, aware of the potential friction his words might cause. I believe that in every age, in every place, we risk growing complacent. Complacency becomes a form of denial, where we forget to question ourselves. Faith becomes mechanical, a routine rather than a living truth. Surah 447 tells us to heed the guidance we've been given, lest our hearts grow hardened. Another cleric, older, with a wiry beard, interrupted. But how do we know your teachings themselves are correct? Do you not interpret the verse in a manner that could lead people astray? The uneducated masses might misunderstand or twist your words. I encourage them to read for themselves, Magomed answered gently. To pray for understanding, to consult learned individuals, to reflect in their hearts. I have never claimed to be the final word. Only the Qur'an and the authentic teachings of our Prophet can hold that place. I am but a vessel, like a breeze that carries a fragrance from a distant garden. The older cleric seemed unconvinced, but he did not press further. A moment of silence stretched through the hall, as though everyone was weighing Magomed's sincerity against the potential risk of letting him continue unrestrained. Then, after a whispered consultation with his advisors, the governor stood, tall and imposing. His voice reverberated across the marble walls. For the moment, the governor pronounced, we will not forbid your gatherings, but heed this warning. You are not to interfere with public order. You are not to speak against the rightful authorities. If we find evidence that your teachings incite rebellion, we will take swift action. Do you understand? Magomed bowed his head. I have no wish to see unrest, Governor. My hope is that, through reflection on the Qur'an, people will become better citizens, kinder neighbors, more compassionate to one another. Islam is not a path of chaos but of peace, submission to the will of God, which calls for justice and mercy. The governor gave a curt nod. Then, for now, you may continue, but we will be watching." With that, Magomed was dismissed from the hall of assembly. As he stepped out into the sunlight, he was met by a sea of anxious faces. A collective hush fell over the crowd, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Then someone near the front asked, "What did they say? Have they forbidden you from speaking?" Magomed offered a small smile. "They have asked me to respect public order and to refrain from inciting upheaval. We shall do both. Islam does not require violence or strife to flourish. It requires open hearts." A wave of relief washed over many who heard his words. People began to disperse, returning to their day's business. Yet a handful lingered, wanting to hear more from him on that very spot. Magomed agreed to speak for a short while, urging them not to fear or respond with anger. "If we trust in God, we will not be consumed by fear," he reminded them. "Remember, Surah 447 calls us to remain steadfast once truth has come to us. That truth is never served by haste or outrage. It is served by patience and sincerity." But even as he spoke words of calm, an undercurrent of tension flowed through the crowd. Some individuals, perhaps more ardent followers, murmured their discontent with the authorities, calling them hypocrites who suppressed genuine faith. Magomed gently cautioned them to avoid bitterness, recalling the Prophet Muhammad's patience in the face of persecution. Yet he could sense that not everyone would heed his plea for understanding. As dusk approached, Magomed returned to his rented lodging. The day's events weighed on him. Though the immediate danger had passed, he was perceptive enough to recognize that this was no permanent resolution, merely a temporary lull. He prostrated himself in prayer, whispering supplications for guidance, for strength, and for the well-being of those who felt lost or burdened by the demands of conscience. That same evening, in a dimly lit chamber far from the public eye, a secret gathering of dissenters unfolded. Unlike the official council, this was a small circle of influential figures who felt that the governor and chief cleric were being far too lenient. They spoke in hushed tones, wary of prying ears. Their leader was a wealthy merchant, whose fortunes depended on certain corrupt practices that he feared Magomed's moral teachings might expose. He tapped his jeweled ring against a polished table, his expression dark with calculation. "This man is dangerous," he hissed to the others. "He stirs the common folk to question everything. Next they'll be examining our trade practices, our claims to authority. They'll wonder why we have so much while others starve. We cannot allow this to fester." Another man nodded, a local magistrate whose complacency had shielded numerous shady dealings. "It's only a matter of time before his followers become emboldened. His talk of truth and moral duty may lead them to demand reform. We could lose our livelihoods or worse." The wealthy merchant leaned forward, his voice dripping with a conspiratorial edge. "If the official council refuses to clamp down, then perhaps we must handle the matter ourselves. Let us find a way to discredit him or to push him out of the city. If necessary, we make sure the people fear him more than they revere him." And so, in that secretive huddle of discontent, a plan began to take shape. A plan to undermine Magomed's credibility, to sow chaos in his gatherings, or perhaps even to implicate him in a crime. They spoke of hiring ruffians to stir up violence during one of his sermons, or bribing vulnerable souls to spread rumors that he was practicing heresy. Anything to feed public suspicion and turn the tide of sentiment against him. In this manner, the seeds of genuine danger were planted. Unaware of the conspiracy taking root, Magomed continued his daily life much the same. He rose before dawn to pray, offered counsel to anyone who sought him out, and spent his evenings in the amphitheater, where the torchlit gatherings now felt at once welcoming and precarious. People still came from far and wide. Among them, scholars intrigued by the phenomenon, devout Muslims eager to rekindle their faith, and simple villagers hoping to glimpse this figure who spoke so ardently of the Qur'an's timeless call. As the nights deepened, Magomed noticed a shift in the questions people asked. Whereas before they had primarily wondered about the verse itself, Surah 447 and its implications, now they also asked about the tension in the city. Were they safe to attend these assemblies? Did Magomed fear retaliation from the authorities? Time and again, he assured them that faith thrived on honesty, not secrecy. He reminded them of the Prophet's trials in Mecca, how the early Muslims faced persecution but never surrendered their core principles. Yet there were moments, fleeting but unsettling, when Magomed glimpsed unfamiliar faces in the amphitheater. Figures lurking at the edges, half hidden by shadows, observing the crowd with cold detachment. Whether they were spies sent by the city's rulers or hirelings of more clandestine adversaries, he could not say. But he sensed that something in the atmosphere had darkened, that the storm clouds of opposition were slowly gathering. Despite the growing tension, Magomed's message did not change. Each night, by the flickering glow of lanterns, he recited verses from the Qur'an, weaving them into parables of everyday life. He described how neglecting a hungry neighbor was akin to turning one's back on divine truth, how harboring malice toward others hardened the heart until truth could no longer penetrate. He spoke of Islam not as a rigid set of rules but as a living bond of responsibility and compassion, reflecting the oneness of God. And time after time, he circled back to Surah 447, urging his audience not to let the gift of revelation slip through their fingers, as so many generations before had done. The simple sincerity of his message drew people in, even as it incensed those who profited from ignorance or exploitation. Gradually, whispers began to spread of an even larger assembly, perhaps the largest yet, where Magomed would speak at length about the role of conscience in public life. Some said it would be a turning point, a definitive moment for the city to decide whether to embrace or reject this stirring of faith. Others warned that it would be the perfect stage for sabotage, an opportunity for those who despised him to strike a fatal blow. Through it all, Magomed remained as unassuming as ever. He ate simple meals, shared what little he had with those in need, and regularly made time for introspective prayer. If fear gripped him, he did not show it outwardly. But in the stillness of night, when the stars stretched across the sky like a silent congregation of witnesses, he would whisper the words of the Qur'an to himself and seek solace in the knowledge that truth ultimately belonged to God alone. If he was merely the bearer of a message, then whatever trials came his way were part of a plan beyond his full understanding. It was in these quiet hours that a new sense of resolve crystallized in him. He recognized that the real test of a believer was not in the absence of adversity but in the steadfast commitment to truth amid adversity. Surah 447 echoed in his thoughts, as if reminding him that those who turned away under pressure risked losing themselves entirely. And so he pressed forward, unafraid to speak in the open, to invite the entire city to witness the power of a faith that demanded integrity and compassion. Unbeknownst to him, on the other side of the city, that same merchant who had convened the secret meeting was finalizing his schemes. Bribes exchanged hands under the cover of darkness, and shadowy figures received their orders. They were to blend into the crowd at the forthcoming assembly, to provoke unrest, to set off a chain reaction that would force the authorities to intervene. Once panic and violence broke out, the blame would fall on Magomed, painting him as the agitator. It was a plan as cunning as it was cruel, relying on the vulnerability of mass gatherings to turn an atmosphere of hope into one of fear. If Magomed could have seen these machinations, perhaps he would have cancelled the assembly. Perhaps he would have found another way to share the message without exposing the people to danger. But the winds of fate were already swirling, and the call of truth, once ignited, was not so easily extinguished. The city, caught in the crosswinds of faith, doubt, ambition, and fear, stood on the cusp of a moment that would test every soul within its walls. Late that evening, as he gazed out over the deserted amphitheater, its stone seats bathed in silver moonlight, Magomed felt a profound heaviness in his heart, coupled with an inexplicable surge of certainty. Though he could not foresee the exact shape of the challenges to come, he knew they were close at hand. And in that hush, his mind turned once more to the words, "O you who have been given the scripture, believe in what we have sent down." It was an eternal summons, and if the city was about to face a trial, so be it. The question was whether they would remain steadfast or turn away. He closed his eyes, letting the stillness settle around him. Then he breathed a final prayer into the night air, trusting that, whatever happened next, the truth he served would outlast any storm. Daylight arrived softly, illuminating the amphitheater where the next large assembly would soon take place. In the early morning hush, only a few guards and caretakers roamed the stone pathways, adjusting lanterns and clearing away any debris. Little did they know how soon the place would fill to overflowing. By midday, travelers and townsfolk alike began streaming in, some on foot, some in creaking wooden carts. Dust kicked up around them, drifting in the desert air as everyone converged on the sight that had come to symbolize both hope and tension. Magomed arrived just as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. He felt the weight of 1,000 questions in the gazes of those who spotted him, yet he greeted them with unwavering warmth. His followers had prepared a simple dais at the center, though he rarely used any sort of podium. Indeed, he often stood at the same ground level as everyone else, believing that no speaker of truth should elevate himself too high above the people who sought it. Still, for the sake of visibility in this great crowd, a slightly raised area had been constructed. He could sense an undercurrent of apprehension among the gathering. Whispers circulated of what had transpired in the Hall of Assembly, how the governor had admonished Magomed to avoid stirring unrest. Many feared that trouble could erupt at any moment, whether from the city's authorities or from shadowy forces who might wish to discredit him. Yet the crowd's curiosity and spiritual longing overpowered their anxiety. They wanted to hear again the verses of the Qur'an, to glimpse once more a clarity they felt had been missing from their daily lives. Just before Magomed began speaking, an itinerant musician, an old man with a weather-beaten face, started to pluck a gentle tune on a stringed instrument near the amphitheater entrance. The melody had no official place in this assembly, yet no one stopped him. The sound was soft, melancholic, like a lament that simultaneously carried a note of hope, an apt backdrop for the moment at hand. Some who heard it felt tears prick their eyes without knowing why. When the hush finally spread through the amphitheater, Magomed lifted his voice in a careful recitation of Surah 447. The solemn resonance of Quranic Arabic rolled across the stones, filling even the highest tiers. This verse, repeated countless times in his travels, nonetheless retained its potency. As he shifted to the local tongue, translating and reflecting on the words, listeners leaned forward as though the meaning might slip through their grasp if they did not pay full attention. He spoke of spiritual heedlessness, not as an abstract concept but as a danger that crept into one's habits and thoughts. He reminded everyone how the Prophet Muhammad had faced indifference and rejection in Mecca, how many of his early opponents had not seen themselves as wicked but simply comfortable in their old ways. Yet comfort, Magomed explained, his voice steady but impassioned, can be the enemy of truth, because to embrace truth often means to examine ourselves, to let go of complacency. Surah 447 calls us to avoid turning away from God's message, but turning away can happen in subtle forms, like neglecting a clear call to compassion because it's inconvenient, or ignoring our conscience because we're afraid of what it might demand of us. He paused, letting the silence expand for a moment. People listened closely, some nodding, others blinking as though seeing themselves reflected in the warnings. Beneath a deepening twilight, torches and lanterns began to glow around the amphitheater, their light flickering against the limestone walls. The scene possessed a mysterious, almost sacred beauty. Yet a keen observer might notice that scattered among the crowd were individuals whose expressions remained guarded. Some stood at the outskirts, eyes darting here and there. They were not here for enlightenment. As Magomed spoke, he felt an unusual tension creeping into the atmosphere. Typically, when he addressed a gathering, a sense of calm prevailed. This night, however, there was an unspoken tautness, as if each word might become a catalyst. He continued nonetheless, weaving parables from Islamic tradition, stories about how earlier communities had lost their way when they chose to ignore the teachings they'd been given. He reminded them how the Qur'an, as well as the examples of the Prophet, stressed humility before God and empathy for every human being. Then, without warning, a dissonant voice cut through the amphitheater. "That's enough!" Heads whipped around to see a man with a scarf wrapped half over his face, stepping onto a low wall. "Why should we trust you?" he shouted, jabbing an accusing finger at Magomed. "You talk of faith, but what do you know of our struggles?" You're nothing but a wandering preacher, stirring hearts with fine words. How does that feed the hungry or bring justice to the oppressed? Confusion rippled through the crowd. Many recognized that anger or debate sometimes arose at these assemblies. But this man's tone carried a raw hostility that felt premeditated. Magomed, however, remained calm. He turned in the direction of the voice, speaking gently enough to diffuse tension. "Brother," he said, "if you are hungry, we can find bread for you. If you are oppressed, let us stand with you." The call of Islam is not empty. It is meant to be practiced in everyday life. That is precisely why we must not reject the truth that urges us to act with compassion. "Words!" The man spat, as if offended by Magomed's measured response. He seemed poised to hurl another insult, perhaps more inflammatory, when a second voice rose from another corner of the amphitheater. "He's misleading you," cried a figure perched near a pillar. "He claims no authority, yet he sets himself above the scholars. He's driving a wedge between the faithful and the rightful religious guides." A murmur of alarm spread through the onlookers. Some recognized these tactics for what they were, an orchestrated attempt to provoke chaos. Yet many others were genuinely disconcerted. The tension thickened as a few men, probably well-meaning defenders of Magomed, began shouting back, telling the hecklers to be silent. Voices overlapped, confusion mounted, and the previously serene gathering started to fracture into pockets of argument. Sensing the danger, Magomed raised his arms, urging everyone to remain calm. "Please," he called out, "remember the teachings of our prophet. Anger does not solve disputes. If you have a question or a criticism, I will do my best to address it. Let us not descend into accusations and shouting." But the masked man and his associates had no interest in civil discussion. One of them pushed roughly through the crowd, barking something about how real believers should not be duped by a traveling mystic. Another deliberately toppled a lantern, sending a gush of flaming oil onto the ground. Startled cries erupted as people scrambled to avoid the fire. Within seconds, the amphitheater's sense of peaceful reflection was replaced by pandemonium. Though the spilled flame was doused quickly, the incident triggered a surge of panic. In the commotion, a few unruly individuals, likely part of the same plot, snatched valuables from frightened spectators, sowing further chaos. Others began shoving to get out of the stands. Someone cried out that soldiers were on their way, that they would surely blame the crowd for this outbreak of disorder. Fear spread like a contagion. Magomed tried to restore calm, but his voice was drowned in the clamor. He managed to guide a few terrified families toward an exit, urging them not to push or trample the weaker members of the crowd. It was then that he witnessed a group of men confronting each other with fists raised. 2 from among his supporters, 3 from the circle of agitators. The men circled each other like predators, tension crackling in the air. "Stop!" Magomed cried, plunging into the group, arms outstretched to separate them. But as he did so, someone seized his shoulder. A rough hand yanked him backward, and he glimpsed the flash of a blade. Chaos blurred his vision. He felt hands shoving him in multiple directions. A swirl of flame from a fallen torch illuminated faces twisted in anger or terror. Then, abruptly, strong arms caught him around the chest and pulled him away, forcing him through the panicked throng. He stumbled, struggling to maintain balance. A voice hissed in his ear, "We have to get you out before they try worse than this." It was one of his companions, a burly man named Rashid. Together, they fought through the sea of jostling bodies, stepping over discarded baskets, overturned stools, and smoldering torches. Shouts and screams echoed, and it seemed as though the entire assembly was dissolving into pandemonium. Magomed's heart sank at the sight of such disorder, his soul aching because the message meant to unite people was now marred by violence orchestrated in the shadows. At last, they reached a small side entrance near the amphitheater's base. A few others joined them, a handful of men and women who had remained steadfast, refusing to be swept into the chaotic spiral. They all hurried down a corridor that led away from the public square. Once they emerged, they slipped between rows of tall date palms, venturing into the quieter outskirts of the city. Only then, under the pale glow of a moon just rising, did they pause to catch their breath. One of the women in the group, her face damp with perspiration and streaked with dust, clutched Magomed's hand. "Are you hurt?" she asked urgently, scanning him for wounds. He shook his head, though a lingering bruise on his arm throbbed from where he had been yanked. "No, I'm all right," he answered, his voice still steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "But so many people. Are they safe?" "I saw families trapped in the crush." Rashid grimaced, wiping sweat from his brow. "There was nothing we could do. A few guards arrived, and the agitators scattered. I suspect it was a deliberate ploy to cause chaos and discredit you. Some might even say you were behind it, trying to incite a riot." Magomed closed his eyes, the weight of realization pressing upon him. This was precisely the outcome those conspirators had wanted. Panic and conflict that could be spun to paint him as the cause. He could almost hear the accusations forming in the minds of the city's leadership. "We must do what we can to restore calm," he said quietly. "We must make it clear that I do not condone any form of violence. If we run or hide, we only appear guilty." Yet returning to his usual lodging that night was fraught with risk. So, at Rashid's insistence, Magomed and his small band of companions made their way to an inconspicuous abode tucked in a poorer district of the city. Here, an elderly widow welcomed them without question. She had listened to Magomed's words before and believed in the sincerity of his cause. In the dimly lit room that served as her main living space, everyone sat on woven mats, faces etched with worry. As the group recounted the events of the amphitheater, how a peaceful assembly had turned into turmoil, a sense of grief weighed on them. The woman, who introduced herself simply as Layla, offered them bowls of lentil stew. The nourishment was a small comfort, a momentary reprieve from the storm beyond those walls. A handful of children, presumably her grandchildren, peered at Magomed from behind a curtain, curiosity mingled with lingering fear. In that room they debated what to do next. Some urged Magomed to slip away from the city before the governor's men came looking for him. Others insisted that running would accomplish nothing but confirm the suspicions of those who called him a provocateur. Layla, stirring the stew pot, spoke in a gentle yet firm voice. "If you came here to awaken hearts, you must not abandon them now. The city is frightened, yes, but the truth does not vanish in the face of fear." Magomed nodded solemnly. "I cannot abandon the mission, but I also won't invite chaos. I need to reach the people again, to reassure them that Islam calls us to peace, not strife. If I disappear, many will assume I'm hiding from my own guilt. If I publicly return, I risk arrest or worse." Rashid looked at Magomed intently. "Perhaps," he said, "the best course is to go directly to the governor and demand an audience. Offer an explanation, show him that you are not behind this. If they're going to come for you, it's better to confront them with the truth now." Some present bristled at the idea of walking into the lion's den. But as the hours wore on and the night pressed forward, it became clear that clarity was needed. The city was brimming with rumors. Some said that Magomed had orchestrated the violence to force attention on himself. Others whispered that a faction of zealots planned to start an uprising in his name. Meanwhile, ordinary people were left to wonder whether the voice they had found so enlightening was actually a spark that set their city aflame. In the pre-dawn stillness, Magomed rose from his restless sleep. He performed ablutions with water that Layla had drawn from a nearby well, then offered his prayers. In the quiet, his forehead pressed against the simple mat, he felt the gravity of Surah 447 once more. How easy it was for humans to turn away from truth the moment it threatened their comfort or confronted their fears. Yet the call remained, unwavering, unyielding. He remembered that the Prophet Muhammad, too, had faced slander and betrayal. Entire tribes had once vilified him for delivering a message of unity. Magomed found solace in the knowledge that the path of every sincere believer was strewn with trials, an inevitable test of faith's authenticity. When he finished praying, he sat in silent reflection until the first faint light of dawn crept over the horizon. That morning, he and Rashid, along with 2 others, made their way through the winding streets toward the governor's palace. Layla insisted on accompanying them partway, refusing to stand idly by while the city's rumor mill ran rampant. She walked with a dignified resolve, her worn sandals slapping the dusty cobblestones. It was a testament to how Magomed's teachings had touched people across social boundaries. She was neither scholar nor traitor, just a woman who believed in the spirit of the Qur'an's message, her faith stronger than her fear. Though city life was awakening, the atmosphere felt subdued. People whispered in doorways, stalls opened later than usual, and guards in the marketplace eyed strangers with suspicion. Some recognized Magomed as he passed, their expressions uncertain, as if they couldn't decide whether to greet him or accuse him. He met their gazes with as much calm as he could muster. In his heart, he prayed for a chance to speak openly, to dispel the cloud of misinformation threatening to drown out the truth. When they reached the governor's palace, a grand structure adorned with columns and mosaics, soldiers with gleaming pikes barred their way. One of them, a stern-eyed officer, demanded to know their business. Rashid explained that they sought an urgent audience with the governor concerning the previous night's disturbance. After a tense pause, the officer conferred in low tones with a subordinate, who then disappeared into the palace's interior. Minutes dragged by like hours. Finally, the guard motioned them through, though he ordered Layla and the others to remain behind. "Only Magomed may enter," he said curtly. Magomed exchanged a worried glance with Rashid, but complied. He walked alone across a polished marble floor, past towering statues of past rulers, until he was admitted into a large reception chamber. There, the governor sat flanked by several officials, including the chief cleric. The mood was grim. The air smelled faintly of incense, though it did little to mask the tension that permeated the room. "You've come willingly," the governor said, sounding almost surprised. "I had dispatched men to look for you. Some claim you are responsible for the riot." Magomed bowed respectfully. "I have nothing to hide." The assembly was meant to be a peaceful sharing of the Qur'an's guidance. Agitators deliberately incited violence. I tried to calm the crowd, but it was too late. People panicked. The chief cleric studied him with narrowed eyes. "And why should we believe you were not behind this? Rumors say you've spoken critically of the city's leadership, that your words might have stirred the people to aggression." Magomed inhaled slowly, gathering his composure. "I have never urged violence. My criticisms, if any, are directed at the moral failings we all share: greed, arrogance, injustice. But these calls for introspection are meant to heal, not to wound. I cannot control those who, with ill intent, choose to exploit a gathering for chaos." The governor leaned back in his ornate chair, tapping his fingers on the armrest. He appeared to weigh Magomed's words carefully. "Witnesses saw masked men provoking the crowd," he said. "If your claim holds true, it suggests a conspiracy, a group determined to undermine your influence." "That is my suspicion," Magomed responded. "Those who profit from corruption or fear the awakening of conscience have reason to stop me. But, Governor, if you truly want peace in your city, you must understand that the fault does not lie in the reminder of truth. It lies in those who wield deception to maintain their power or wealth." A tense silence followed. The officials and the chief cleric exchanged glances, uncertain whether Magomed's statement veered too close to accusing them. Then the cleric cleared his throat. "You speak boldly. Yet it is also bold to assume your personal interpretation of Surah 447 is the one correct path." Magomed met the cleric's gaze respectfully. "My interpretation revolves around the verse's clear message: do not turn away once guidance has reached you. That guidance, in Islam, includes justice, compassion, and the unity of God. If those are controversial statements, then perhaps the problem lies not with me, but with anyone who profits from ignoring those principles." The governor exhaled sharply. "We do not deny the validity of those principles," he said, casting a wary glance at his advisors. "But the city is unsettled. The people are frightened. Perhaps it is best if you withdraw from public gatherings for a while, to let tensions cool." Magomed's heart sank. "Governor, If we allow fear to silence the call to truth, haven't we already surrendered to falsehood? Enough. The governor's tone was clipped, leaving no room for argument. I must maintain order. I cannot have thousands congregating under the threat of violence. For your own safety, and for the cities, you should cease these nightly assemblies. If you persist in holding them, I may have no choice but to take you into custody, for the sake of preventing further chaos. Magomed bowed his head, mindful of the precarious situation. I cannot disobey, but I hope you understand that people came to hear words of the Qur'an because they yearn for it. Stifling that yearning will not make it disappear. The governor looked weary. For a moment, sympathy flickered in his gaze. Whether genuine or not, it was difficult to say. Return to your lodging, he said more softly. We will investigate the matter of the agitators. But heed this warning. If another riot or disturbance occurs, you and your followers will be held accountable. Magomed nodded, sensing the finality of the pronouncement. He quietly took his leave, escorted again by guards through the palace halls until he stepped out into the bright daylight. Outside, Rashid, Layla, and the others hurried to him. A single glance at Magomed's expression told them the outcome was not in their favor. He wants you silenced, Rashid muttered, his fists clenching. After everything we've endured, they're shutting you down as though you're the danger. Layla placed a trembling hand on Magomed's arm. Will you comply? Magomed paused, looking at the palace's imposing facade. I cannot hold large gatherings without incurring blame for any trouble. To defy the governor openly would risk a confrontation that could harm innocent people. But the truth remains, whether spoken in a grand amphitheater or whispered in a back alley. Surah 447 does not become invalid because the city's leadership is uneasy. They left the palace precincts, weaving through a crowd that still carried the aftermath of the previous night's chaos. At corners, clusters of citizens discussed the event in hushed voices, speculating on who had truly been responsible for the violence. Few recognized Magomed among them. Those who did seemed hesitant to approach, uncertain of his status in the aftermath. As they reached a quieter lane, Magomed spoke to his companions in a subdued tone. We need to adapt. If we can't teach openly, we find smaller spaces, homes, courtyards, anywhere people can gather without provoking hostility. Word will still spread, Rashid said. They may come for you anyway. Then let them come, Magomed answered. Our intent is not rebellion. If the city's leadership chooses to interpret sincerity as a threat, that is on them. But we will not be the ones to spark conflict. Layla nodded. I know a network of homes, humble but safe. Let us see how many people wish to learn the Qur'an in quieter ways. And so, in the days that followed, Magomed's teaching took on a new form. Rather than summoning large crowds, he visited small gatherings, sometimes in the back of a shop after closing hours, sometimes in a family's courtyard. He offered reflections on the Qur'an, especially Surah 447, reminding everyone present that the real turning away from truth often occurred not from grand gestures but from the accumulation of small neglects. Word of mouth replaced public proclamations. People whispered to their neighbors that Magomed would be sharing a lesson at a certain alley or by a certain well at dusk. Those determined to hear came quietly, slipping in without fanfare. They sat on rugs beneath starlight or lantern light, listening intently as he spoke of the Prophet Muhammad's patience and the abiding nature of God's guidance. Many found the intimacy of these smaller gatherings even more moving, as though the hush itself carried a certain reverence. But trouble brewed in the shadows. The wealthy merchant who had orchestrated the previous riot grew frustrated by Magomed's resilience. His carefully planted disruption had not extinguished the man's influence. It had merely pushed it underground, making it harder to attack directly. And so, he and his co-conspirators adapted their tactics. They dispatched informants to infiltrate the small gatherings, searching for any hint of sedition. They whispered bribes to city guards, urging them to arrest Magomed's followers on flimsy charges. They circulated slanderous rumors, accusing Magomed of heretical teachings or of plotting against the governor. Slowly, these efforts took their toll. A climate of suspicion settled over the city. Friends wondered if they could trust each other. Families argued about whether to attend clandestine lessons or avoid them for fear of arrest. Some who had been initially enthusiastic began to distance themselves, unwilling to risk their livelihoods or their safety for a man who might, in their eyes, be a catalyst for further upheaval. Magomed grieved this growing atmosphere of mistrust, but he continued teaching those who remained steadfast. Among the steadfast were individuals from diverse walks of life. A blacksmith who found solace in the rhythmic recitation of the Qur'an after long hours of labor. A former soldier disillusioned by the cruelty he had witnessed. A young woman who had lost her parents yet found hope in the idea that compassion could transcend bitterness. Their faith, tested by adversity, grew deeper in these hidden lessons. Some of them recounted the Prophet's experiences in the early days of Islam, drawing parallels to Magomed's plight, though he always hastened to clarify that he was simply a believer trying to do his part, not a prophet himself. The small gatherings took on a spirit of unity that transcended fear. They shared food and resources, offered protection to one another, and cared for any orphans or widows who had fallen through the cracks of a city too busy or too corrupt to notice their plight. In these acts, they believed they were living out the heart of Surah 447, choosing to respond to the truth that beckoned them toward mercy and communal solidarity, rather than turning away in self-centeredness. Yet, for all the good that sprouted in those hidden corners, the powers aligned against Magomed were growing bolder. The wealthy merchant, in particular, realized that smears and minor disruptions weren't enough. He needed something decisive, an undeniable pretext to force the governor's hand and ensure Magomed's final downfall. This time, the plan ventured into grim territory. He found men willing to stoop to violence for a price. Men who would not hesitate at the thought of bloodshed. Under cloak of darkness, they gathered in a warehouse near the city's eastern gate. Their instructions were simple. Lure Magomed into a situation where he would appear to be conspiring against the governor, or engineer a confrontation where someone of importance would be harmed, and pin the blame on Magomed. If all went well, the city's leadership would have no choice but to clamp down on him as a dangerous insurrectionist. As these agents of conspiracy honed their plot, an air of foreboding descended upon the city. It was as though the desert winds themselves carried rumors of an impending climax, one that would test not only Magomed's resolve but also the mettle of those around him. Even among ordinary citizens, a strange hush seemed to settle. Many avoided meeting each other's eyes in the streets, fearful that an ill-timed conversation could be misconstrued as treason. The market's once lively chatter grew subdued, replaced by furtive glances. Despite the looming threat, Magomed persevered in his discreet lessons, unwavering in his commitment to share the Quran's guidance. There came an evening when a small group had gathered in an abandoned courtyard behind an old library, the night sky a canopy of scattered stars. A single lantern illuminated their circle, casting long shadows on the crumbling walls. As he so often did, Magomed chose to recite Surah 447. When he reached the part about not turning away once one has recognized the truth, he paused, letting the words settle. Then, very quietly, he said, "Sometimes the hardest truths to accept are those about ourselves. Our pride, our fears, our illusions of control. It is easier to reject them, to run from the messages that awaken us. But if we do so, we only remain prisoners of our own shadow." A ripple of empathy went through those listening, each recalling some personal struggle or moral failing. One of the attendants, a middle-aged man with worry lines etched into his face, raised a trembling hand. "I fear for my family," he confessed. "We believe in what you teach, but my wife says we must leave the city. She fears the authorities, and she's right, they are everywhere. Is it wrong to flee in the face of danger?" Magomed studied the man sympathetically. "It is not wrong to protect your loved ones," he answered. "When the early Muslims were persecuted, many migrated to Abyssinia, seeking refuge. Later, the Prophet himself migrated to Medina. What matters is that you do not turn away from the call of righteousness in your heart, that you do not become complicit in injustice or denial." The man nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "Then perhaps we will go, not to abandon faith but to preserve it until a safer time." Magomed reached out and clasped the man's shoulder. "May God guide you." And remember, truth does not depend on location. It lives in our hearts and actions. They continued discussing various concerns: how to care for those left behind, how to maintain spiritual practice under mounting hostility, until, from the darkness, Rashid approached with hurried footsteps. His expression was grim. He pulled Magomed aside, his voice kept low. "There's word from a friend among the city guards," he said. "A trap is being set. They plan to corner you in one of these hidden gatherings and accuse you of plotting an uprising. I don't know the details, but apparently the conspirators have bribed half a dozen guards to act as witnesses." Magomed's chest tightened, though he maintained a calm facade. "And the governor? Is he part of it?" "I can't be certain," Rashid replied. "But it sounds like those who hate you are leveraging the city's fear. If the governor believes you're plotting against him, he'll have you arrested immediately." Magomed glanced around at the small circle of people huddled under the dim lantern glow. Each one had come in search of spiritual nourishment and found themselves tangled in the crosswinds of a city on edge. "Perhaps the time has come to leave," he said quietly, echoing the middle-aged man's dilemma. "If my presence endangers others and offers a pretext for violence, maybe I should go somewhere they cannot reach me." Rashid hesitated, torn. "Yet you've always taught us that truth shouldn't hide from adversity. If you leave, might that not be seen as turning your back on the cause?" Magomed sighed. "Remaining could mean bloodshed, an excuse for them to arrest not just me but any who stand by me. The question is, which course leads to preserving the essence of what we've worked to awaken?" He recalled again how the prophet had migrated, not out of cowardice but out of wisdom, ensuring that faith could flourish rather than be stamped out prematurely. The decision weighed heavily on him. In the end, he resolved to consult with the faithful who had gathered in secret, letting them voice their fears and hopes. Some insisted that he should stay, that they would protect him. Others believed that preserving life and continuing the mission elsewhere would prevent a catastrophic crackdown. All the while, the night grew darker, the faint hum of the city's tensions throbbing like a distant drumbeat. In the quiet hours near dawn, Magomed found himself alone, perched on a fragment of crumbled stone in that deserted courtyard. His face was turned upward to the sky, silently contemplating the infinite expanse of stars and the presence of the divine beyond. His mind roiled with questions about duty, sacrifice, and the fine line between steadfastness and needless risk. He whispered verses from the Qur'an, seeking clarity. The chill in the air made him pull his cloak closer, and for a moment he was seized by a deep longing for the simpler life he had once known. A time before he had stepped onto this path of teaching, a time when he was just a fisherman's son by the sea. Yet those days were gone, replaced by an unyielding sense that he was called to serve a greater purpose. As he prayed, he sensed a profound stillness envelop him, as if the night itself were listening. Perhaps it was an answer from above, or perhaps it was the calm that sometimes comes when one releases the weight of uncertainty to God's infinite wisdom. A renewed determination took root in his heart, despite the risks that lay ahead. When morning arrived, he gathered those who remained loyal. In a voice steady but tinged with sadness, he explained his decision. He would leave the city discreetly, traveling to distant regions where his words might still resonate without triggering immediate persecution. Those who wished could follow, but no one was obliged. For those who stayed behind, he urged them to continue living by the teachings they had embraced, caring for each other, remaining truthful in their dealings, and not allowing cynicism or fear to corrupt their newfound faith. Some wept, others nodded stoically. A silent agreement passed among them, that though Magomed might depart, the spiritual foundation they had built would remain, like an undercurrent shaping the city's conscience in ways not easily visible. And so, as quietly as he had arrived, he prepared to slip away under the next night's cover. Rashid and a small group of trusted companions planned to accompany him, while Layla and a few others would stay to safeguard the small network of believers. Yet even as they finalized these plans, forces beyond their control continued to move. The conspirators had already laid traps throughout the city, determined to catch Magomed and present him as a traitor. On the eve of his departure, He learned that the city gates were under special surveillance. Anyone leaving with a group would be stopped and interrogated. The tension escalated hour by hour, until it felt as though even the walls themselves listened for whispered secrets. In the end, it was decided they would separate into pairs and slip out by different routes, reuniting at a desert rendezvous beyond the governor's jurisdiction. Magomed set out with Rashid just after midnight, navigating narrow alleys by moonlight. They avoided main roads, winding instead through neglected districts where patrols were sparse. At times, the flickering torch of a lone sentinel made them freeze against a shadowed wall, hearts pounding until the footsteps receded. Still, a nagging sense of unease tugged at Magomed's thoughts. He felt as though eyes were watching from unseen vantage points. And indeed, he was correct. In one darkened alley, as they passed an abandoned stable, a group of hooded men emerged like wraiths from the gloom. Their leader's voice sliced through the silence. "Going somewhere, Magomed?" Rashid stepped forward, fists clenched. But the men were armed, daggers glinted in the moonlight. Magomed recognized at least one face, partially revealed by the shifting shadows, as someone he had seen lurking at the amphitheater on the night of the riot. A grim recognition settled over him. These were no ordinary robbers. They were the hired agents who served those determined to crush him, and they clearly had no intention of letting him leave the city peacefully. Blood pounded in Magomed's ears as he considered the possibility that this might be the end of his journey. Surah 447 rushed back into his mind, reminding him not to turn away from truth, even when confronted with mortal danger. Whether that truth would save him now, he could not say. But in his heart, he braced himself for a trial more harrowing than any he had faced before. The hooded men closed in, blades at the ready, and the night around them fell silent as a grave, waiting to see which path fate would take. Magomed and Rashid found themselves cornered in the dimly lit alley, the hooded figures methodically closing in around them. That swirling moment, suspended between frantic heartbeats, seemed to stretch time itself. Shadows rippled across the rough stone walls while an unspoken tension crackled in the stagnant air. Fear pulsed through Magomed's veins, and yet he felt a curious calm welling within him as well, as if a deeper certainty were rising to meet the threat. "Stay back," Rashid growled, stepping forward with a show of readiness. Though he had no sword, he possessed a fierce determination that gleamed in his eyes. A single dagger glinted in the alley's half-light, brandished by the man who led the group. Others behind him held shorter blades or crude clubs. Their faces were half obscured by scarves or hoods, and in their bearing lurked the confidence of men who had brawled many times in the city's underbelly. Magomed inhaled carefully. "There is no need for violence," he said, trying to project calm. "We are leaving. We have harmed no one in this place." The leader of the hooded men let out a sneering laugh that reverberated off the walls. "Your teaching is a threat," he spat. "You disturb the city's balance. Our employers prefer that balance remain undisturbed." Rashid tensed, fists curled tight. "Balance," he echoed bitterly. "You mean the system of bribes and injustice?" Another voice hissed from the group, "Silence him." The malice in that tone showed how little interest they had in peaceful dialogue. For a heartbeat, Magomed wondered if reasoning might still be possible, but the hostility emanating from the men was palpable like a hot wind. Their eyes burned with intent. He recalled Surah 447 again, how it warned against turning away from truth. These men, it seemed, had indeed turned away from any moral code, enticed by power or gold. No words, he sensed, would sway them now. The clash came swiftly. Rashid moved first to parry a blow aimed at Magomed, grappling with a stout attacker. Their bodies slammed into the alley wall, rattling loose bits of crumbling mortar. Magomed found himself lunged at by a wiry figure wielding a dagger. He twisted aside, sparks skittering as metal scraped the stone. Instinct guided him more than skill. He was no warrior. But desperation lent him agility. He managed to shove the man away just as Rashid struck another assailant with a makeshift cudgel, a piece of broken timber that had been lying in refuse. Chaos erupted in the narrow space. Grunts of pain, the thud of fists connecting with flesh, the metallic rasp of blades, all merged into a confusing cacophony. The stench of sweat and fear hung in the stale air. "Watch out!" Rashid barked, but Magomed was already ducking another swing. A blade whistled by his ear. He staggered, trying to regain his footing on the uneven cobblestones. The attacker pressed in, snarling under his hood as if taking grim satisfaction in cornering his prey. Heart pounding, Magomed kicked out, catching the man in the knee and momentarily halting his advance. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Rashid gasping, blood staining his side. The big man struck one thug with enough force to knock him to the ground, but two more closed in, fists raised. A spike of panic clutched at Magomed's chest. They were outnumbered and physically outmatched. Suddenly a shout rang out from the alley's entrance. Torchlight flared. Perhaps a handful of curious citizens or a small patrol had heard the commotion. The hooded attackers froze for a second, exchanging glances. Their leader snarled something under his breath, then signaled a retreat. In an instant, they melted into the darkness. The last one to vanish cast Magomed a malignant glare, a silent vow that this was far from over. Panting, bruised, and bleeding from superficial cuts, Magomed and Rashid staggered toward the alley's mouth. A short, elderly woman peered at them, eyes wide with shock. "What on earth happened?" she muttered, clutching the tattered shawl at her throat. Rashid clung to the wall. "We were attacked," he managed through gritted teeth. "We need to get out of the city." Several onlookers hovered uncertainly, uncertain whether to call for guards or simply let them pass. News traveled quickly in such neighborhoods. Rumors could spark fear faster than the flick of a torch. Magomed, chest heaving, thanked them for their concern but urged them to return to their homes. "The streets aren't safe tonight," he said gently. He and Rashid pressed on, wending through the maze of streets and alleys. Blood seeped through Rashid's tunic, though he insisted it was a shallow wound. Every shadow felt laden with threat. More hired thugs could lurk around any corner. Still, they inched closer to one of the city's smaller gates where the watch might be less vigilant or less corrupt. At last, they emerged onto a broad street lit by sparse lanterns. Two gate guards stood by, leaning on their spears. Approaching warily, Magomed recognized one guard as a younger man who had once attended one of his gatherings. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting second, Magomed sensed the man's hesitation. He might remember Magomed's lessons, or he might feel compelled to obey orders and detain him. Still reeling from the scuffle, Magomed could only pray that suspicion would not triumph over basic decency. In a stroke of mercy, the guard pretended not to notice Magomed's identity. "Robbers?" he asked tersely, eyeing the bloody stain on Rashid. Rashid nodded, pressing his hand against his side. "Yes. Please, we need to leave and find help." The guard exchanged a glance with his partner. Then he stepped aside, muttering, "You're clear. But hurry on." Without further question, they slipped through. The city walls loomed behind them, tall and foreboding in the torchlight. The crisp air of the open desert washed over them. Beyond the ramparts lay emptiness, sand, rock, and star-scattered skies that offered no illusions of safety but also no immediate conspirators. For a moment, they paused, trembling with adrenaline. Then they began walking, guided only by the faint moonlight and their urgent desire to reach the rendezvous where their companions were supposed to gather. By previous arrangement, they were all to meet some miles past the city walls at a rocky outcrop that provided a modest windbreak. There, those who had elected to flee with Magomed would regroup before pressing onward. Despite Rashid's injury, they kept a steady pace, nerves prickling at every sound. The glow of the city behind them dimmed until it was only a suggestion of light on the horizon. As they neared the designated spot, a soft flicker of lamplight came into view. A lone figure, Karim, an older man loyal to Magomed, stood watch. When he recognized them in the darkness, his posture sagged with relief. "By the Almighty, I was worried you'd never come," he said, hurrying forward. "What happened?" Rashid slumped onto a flat boulder, grimacing with pain. "Hired thugs," he replied. "We barely escaped." Karim's hands shook as he helped them. "Others have arrived, too. Some are hurt, but not as badly. No sign of the city guards yet, though we fear they might come after us." Within a shallow depression in the rocks, a small group waited, including Layla and several others who had followed Magomed's teachings. Soft exclamations of concern rose as they saw Magomed's bruises and Rashid's wound. They offered water, tore strips of cloth for bandages, and muttered blessings that they had made it this far. Magomed's heart clenched at the sight of these refugees of conscience. He recognized faces from the hidden gatherings, each person forced to abandon a life and a city simply because they wished to honor the moral demands of the Qur'an. Guilt and determination warred within him. He hadn't asked anyone to flee, but his teachings had inspired devotion, and that devotion had led them here. Layla, breathing hard, kneeled beside Rashid to tend his wound. "Thank God it's not too deep," she observed, her voice tremulous but controlled. "We have little in the way of medicine, but I can clean it." Rashid winced. "Do your worst," he joked weakly, trying to put on a brave face. They gathered around a small fire, keeping it low to avoid detection. In hushed voices, people recounted their escapes. One young man, eyes still wide with shock, told how he dodged men ransacking the courtyard of his home. Another woman, cradling a small child, admitted she had lied to neighbors, pretending she was simply going on a journey to visit relatives lest they report her. Fear, relief, and sorrow mingled in every account. At length, attention turned to Magomed. "What do we do now?" someone asked, voice quivering. "We can't return to the city. But we can't stay here indefinitely." Magomed cleared his throat, aware that every eye was on him. He swallowed, trying to steady himself. When the early Muslims were driven from Mecca, they found refuge in Medina. He began softly. "We have no Medina promised to us, but perhaps there is some place, some remote village or another city, where we can live without constant fear. Where we might share the Qur'an's teachings in peace." Karim shifted, wincing at a bruised knee. "You mean we should keep traveling? Out here in the desert, unprotected?" Magomed nodded. "For now, yes. The city's reach is strong, especially in nearby trade routes, so we'll move away gradually. Let us rely on God's guidance, as Surah 447 reminds us never to abandon the truth once it has touched our hearts. We must hold to it even when worldly powers threaten us." Layla cast a troubled glance at the child in her lap who had dozed off in the fire's warmth. "I don't regret following you," she murmured. "But I do worry. Survival out here will not be easy." A pang of empathy constricted Magomed's chest. He recalled nights in the city when the amphitheater glowed with torches and hope buzzed among the faithful. How distant that seemed now. "I promise," he said quietly, "we will do everything in our power to keep each other safe. God willing, we'll find a place to settle, perhaps a small community willing to hear a different perspective. Until then, we must remain cautious." The next day brought a watery dawn that tinted the desert horizon in pale blues and yellows. Aching and exhausted, they roused themselves from fitful sleep. Magomed tested his limbs, relieved to find that although he was sore and bruised, he could walk. Rashid, despite the painful slash in his side, could also manage, aided by a makeshift staff. Little by little, they scavenged and packed their few possessions. Then they set off. Dusty plains stretched before them, dotted with hardy shrubs and clusters of jagged rocks. Overhead, the sun rose in silent majesty, promising heat that would test their endurance. Their group, a ragtag assembly of believers, moved with slow determination. Some had walked away from comfortable homes, while others had lived in poverty even within the city walls, yet all now shared the same status as exiles for their faith. Surah 447 hung like an invisible banner in their minds, reminding them that once awakened, truth demanded loyalty even when tested by hardship. As miles fell behind them, the city's silhouette disappeared. The desert became their companion, a place both punishing and strangely purifying. By midday, thirst gnawed at them, and they sought whatever shade a small outcropping of rocks could provide. They rationed their water, each sip a reminder of the fragility of human life under the blazing sun. That evening, they located a narrow ravine that offered shelter from the wind. Karim found a small trickle of water in a crevice, enough to refill a few skins. The sense of relief was palpable. Night descended, and they lit a modest fire. Over its flames, Layla and another woman heated a thin soup, adding bits of dried lentils. Though it was sparse fare, none complained. The warmth and faint flavor felt miraculous under the circumstances. Around the fire, conversation was subdued. People exchanged murmured updates about injuries, speculated on how far the city's reach extended, and wondered aloud if the conspirators might still pursue them. Yet amid the tension, a glimmer of gratitude persisted. They were alive, they were together, and the desert sky was an expanse of stars that dwarfed any mortal threat. Rashid, still pale, gave Magomed a pained grin. "We've come a long way from the amphitheater, haven't we?" Magomed offered a soft laugh. "A lifetime ago, it seems. But the verse remains the same. It guided us there, and it guides us now." They took turns keeping watch overnight, half expecting a band of cutthroats to materialize out of the darkness. But the desert was quiet, the hush broken only by the faint rustle of wind over the rocks. Come morning, they resumed their journey. Over the next few days, they pressed farther from the city, following rough directions gleaned from travelers Magomed once knew. Sometimes they had no path but the sun's arc and the vague outline of distant hills. They trudged through shifting dunes, across salt flats that glimmered deceptively, and through shallow wadis that occasionally revealed clusters of palm trees near hidden springs. Each small oasis was a gift, a respite for body and spirit alike. At one such oasis, they encountered a roaming band of nomads. The tribespeople regarded them with guarded curiosity. Their leader, a wiry man in a tattered keffiyeh, questioned them in a dialect unfamiliar to some of Magomed's companions. But the universal needs of travelers, water, safe passage, shelter, bridged the language gap. After cautious exchanges, the nomads agreed to let them camp nearby. They even shared a meal of goat stew, taking an interest in Magomed's recitations of Quranic verses. The synergy felt like a reminder that beyond the city's politics, humanity could still connect through faith and compassion. Each night around the fire, the group renewed its sense of solidarity. Magomed often recited Surah 447, explaining its message in simple, heartfelt terms. Let us not be as those who knew but chose ignorance. Let us remain awake to the moral call, no matter how the world resists. These words resonated all the more powerfully under the stars, far from marble halls and the clamor of urban life. Still, the harsh realities of desert travel wore on them. Layla's younger companion grew sick from dehydration, drifting into bouts of fever. Rashid's wound, while healing, left him weakened. Tempers sometimes flared when water ran low or hunger gnawed. The illusions of grand religious ecstasy gave way to the daily grind of survival. Yet through it all, small acts of kindness persisted. Someone would share an extra ration of water, or prop a cloak against the sun for the feverish man, or recite comforting verses in the darkest hours of the night. At last, after nearly a week of journeying, they glimpsed a chain of low mountains in the distance. Karim's eyes lit with recognition. If my memory serves, he said, a valley lies just beyond those ridges. My relatives dwell there, or at least they did years ago. It may not be a paradise, but it might be safer than open desert. They pressed on, the terrain becoming craggier, with rocky foothills that forced them to watch every step. Beyond each rise, they hoped to see green fields or a cluster of mud brick dwellings. Instead, they found mostly barren slopes and narrow defile. Evening fell once more, and they took refuge in a canyon that provided some protection from the wind. The following morning, just as the sun crested the mountaintops, they descended into a shallow valley. A scattering of dwellings appeared, built from clay and stone, their roofs fashioned from dried reeds. Thin columns of smoke curled upward, signaling cooking fires. People moved in the distance, perhaps tending goats or gathering brush. The sight lifted the group's spirits. They had finally found a settlement. Karim led them down a winding path. Dogs barked at their approach, spooking Layla's young companion, but no one turned back. Soon, a handful of villagers appeared, forming a loose semicircle, wary yet not outright hostile. One older man stepped forward. He wore a threadbare shawl and carried a shepherd's staff, which he leaned on heavily. His hair, snowy white, framed a lined face that spoke of hardship and endurance. "Who are you?" the man asked in a gravelly voice. Karim offered a hesitant smile. "Uncle Farid? It's me, Karim. I came here many years ago, if you remember." The old man peered closer. "Karim, yes, I recall a boy who wandered off after his father died. You've returned." Karim's eyes glistened. "I have. And these are my companions. We seek refuge. We mean no harm." A low murmur passed among the villagers. Though not exactly welcoming, they were also not immediately dismissive. Uncle Farid motioned for them to follow. "Come. We have little here, but if you carry trouble, best we hear of it first." They proceeded into the heart of the settlement, an assortment of small huts and a central area where a dilapidated well stood. Chickens pecked at the dirt. Children peered out from behind doorways, curiosity mingling with apprehension. A withered garden patch showed that water was scarce, yet some effort was made to cultivate a few vegetables. Everything about the place spoke of resilience wrung from a harsh environment. Under Uncle Farid's direction, the group gathered on woven mats near the well. A handful of villagers, mostly elders and a few younger men, circled around. Karim explained that they had fled persecution for their religious convictions. He tactfully avoided details that might incite alarm, focusing on the need for a safe haven. Magomed listened quietly, only speaking when asked directly. When Uncle Farid inquired about Magomed, Karim described him as a teacher who quoted the Qur'an, especially Surah 447, urging people to remain steadfast to the truth. This elicited a range of reactions from mild suspicion to a flicker of interest. One younger man, arms folded, scoffed, "We're not philosophers here. We just want enough water and food to live. If you bring trouble, you'd best move on." A woman with a kind, careworn face approached them with a clay pitcher. She offered each a drink of cool water, her voice soft. "We are devout too, in our own way. If you speak truth, we'll hear it. But if you stir conflict, it will not go well for you here." Magomed bowed his head in gratitude. "Thank you for your hospitality. We do not wish to stir any strife. Only to live and to share the words of the Qur'an with those willing to listen. We will help in any way we can if you'll allow us to stay." Uncle Farid considered this, his lined brow furrowing. "I can spare a small plot of land where you can pitch tents or build a shelter. As for food, we have little, but if you work the fields and tend the goats, you can earn your share. On one condition, no trouble with the authorities. We have enough worries." Magomed exchanged glances with his weary companions. A glimmer of relief lit his eyes. Though the arrangement was fragile, it was far better than endless wandering. "We accept," he said softly. "May God reward your kindness." And so began a new chapter of their exile. The villagers led them to a patch of uneven ground near the edge of the valley bordered by scraggly brush. A shallow stream trickled not far away, enough for them to fetch water. They quickly set to work erecting simple shelters from branches and cloth. Rashid, though still weak, insisted on helping gather stones to form a crude windbreak. Layla and the others used what they learned in the city to rig cooking areas and sleeping spaces, forging a makeshift camp that felt more permanent than the desert bivouacs of their recent days. Though they were outsiders, the settlement's daily rhythm soon became partially their own. At dawn, roosters crowed and people roused for prayer and chores. Some of Magomed's group joined the villagers in tending goats, learning to maneuver them across the rocky slopes to graze on sparse vegetation. Others volunteered to repair broken fences or haul water from the stream. Bit by bit, they integrated. Magomed spent much of his time laboring alongside Karim or Rashid, but in the evenings a few villagers would drift toward their campfire, curiosity pushing them to hear more about the Quranic teachings that had driven these wanderers from their home. Though some remained skeptical, others found solace in Magomed's words, especially the way he connected Surah 447 to the daily struggles of survival. "Isn't it turning away from truth," he would ask gently, "if we watch our neighbors starve and do nothing? Or if we practice empty rituals without letting mercy govern our interactions?" He never berated them, he posed these questions as invitations to reflection. And the listeners, often worn by the day's toil, began to see in his message a call that resonated with their own existence. Word spread quietly through the settlement. Some who had dismissed Magomed as just another itinerant preacher now took note that the new arrivals worked hard and asked for no special favors. In fact, they shared their meager supplies with those who needed them more. When a villager's child fell ill, Layla helped nurse him with herbs she'd gleaned from desert travelers. When the goats strayed in the night, Rashid, ignoring his healing injury, joined the search party. These small acts steadily softened suspicion. Uncle Farid, initially guarded, began showing them pockets of the valley where wild thyme and other edible plants grew, grateful that they were helping lighten the burden on the existing community. Several times he muttered grudgingly that at least they were more helpful than he'd expected. Still, no one could forget the underlying fragility of their situation. If word reached the city that Magomed and his followers had settled here, might armed men descend to root them out? Or would the conspirators spread more slander, labeling Magomed a fugitive or insurgent? The valley offered a temporary shield, but it was not an impregnable fortress. Moreover, resources in the settlement remained scarce. The goats were few, and the fields, though tilled with earnest effort, yielded only modest crops. Surviving the harsh climate took a toll on everyone, old and new alike. Every day, as the sun beat down on their brows, they were reminded that even the simplest life demanded resilience. Amid these challenges, Magomed found moments of deep spiritual significance. Under the vast starry sky, with the rocky valley walls framing the silence of night, he recited the Qur'an in an unhurried cadence. Men and women from both his group and the village would sometimes gather, drawn by the serene atmosphere. Surah 447, by now so familiar to them, felt renewed in meaning every time it was uttered, a caution not to become complacent, not to let adversity or routine diminish one's commitment to living by divine guidance. One evening, as the red sun dipped behind the mountains, a small gathering formed around Magomed's campfire. Uncle Farid himself ambled over, leaning on his staff, curiosity alight in his weathered eyes. The chatter subsided as Magomed lifted his voice to recite. In the hush, the Arabic syllables echoed gently against the stone backdrop, weaving a tapestry of sound that felt both otherworldly and intimately close. Afterward, the group sat in reflective silence. Then Uncle Farid cleared his throat. "I've heard many speak of the Qur'an," he said, his voice rough with age, "but rarely do they tie it so closely to compassion and everyday duty. My father taught me religion was about reverence. You speak of it as also about responsibility to each other, to the world. Is that truly at the heart of Islam?" Magomed's face glowed in the firelight. "Yes, uncle. Reverence and responsibility are intertwined. The Prophet Muhammad taught us that our worship is incomplete if we ignore the needs of our neighbors. The Quran demands humility before God, yet it also demands justice in how we treat creation." A younger villager, perched on a rock, spoke next. "But in the city we heard rumors that you caused riots. If you preach kindness, how could that be?" Magomed sighed, the memory weighing on him. "There are those who fear the implications of truth, fear losing their power or wealth. They twisted my words, orchestrated chaos to cast blame on me. We fled to avoid bloodshed." Uncle Farid gave a low grunt. "Powerful men often do such things. I've seen it in my time." "Well, as long as you keep your peace here, you're welcome." May God help us if your enemies come. The subtle tension in his words reminded everyone that safety was neither absolute nor permanent. But for the moment, the villagers chose hospitality over fear, and that was enough. The days that followed blended into a rhythm of toil and prayer. With the help of Magomed's group, the settlement repaired an old irrigation channel. They pulled labor to dig deeper near the well, coaxing slightly more water from the parched ground. From sunrise until the midday heat became unbearable, they labored side by side, forging bonds stronger than they realized. In the afternoons, some would gather for learning and discussion, listening to Magomed recite not just Surah 447 but other passages that spoke of patience, gratitude, and mutual help. Young children started to visit the newcomers' camp with shy curiosity, drawn by the warmth and occasional extra morsels of food. Rashid, who had a playful nature despite his burly appearance, often teased them gently or taught them small bits of Quranic verses. Their laughter, echoing in the stony valley, became a balm for the adults' weary souls. As the settlement stabilized under a fragile yet growing sense of camaraderie, Magomed allowed himself a cautious hope. Perhaps, against all odds, they might build a humble refuge here, an echo of the Prophet's early community where faith transcended tribal or political divisions. Though the villagers were not all devout, many possessed decent hearts. Even the skeptics seemed disarmed by the sincerity of these exiles, who asked for little and offered much. Yet rumors began to trickle in through occasional travelers. One merchant who passed through the valley mentioned that city officials were still investigating the fugitive teacher. Another traveler, hearing this, claimed that influential men in the city had increased bounties on information leading to Magomed's capture. Hearing these reports, the settlement grew uneasy. Some villagers cast nervous glances at Magomed's camp. A dark question lingered: would continuing to shelter these outsiders provoke the wrath of distant powers? Uncle Farid convened a small council of elders to discuss the matter. He invited Magomed to speak as well, wanting to decide collectively rather than in secret. In a cramped room that smelled of goat's milk and smoke, they sat on mats arranged in a circle. "This is not a large or wealthy village," Uncle Farid said bluntly. "If troops come demanding we hand you over, we can't fight them. Many of us think it'd be best if you moved on for everyone's sake." Kareem and Layla, attending the meeting, exchanged anxious looks. They had grown fond of this place, meager as it was. Leaving again would mean plunging back into uncertainty. Could they blame the villagers for wanting them gone? Magomed took a measured breath. "We understand your concerns. We never intended to endanger you. If you believe it's best we leave, we will respect that. But please let us stay long enough for the wounded to heal and for us to gather enough provisions. We are not ungrateful for what you have done." A younger elder who had recently warmed to Magomed's teachings interjected. "Many here appreciate your help and your message. Chasing you away prematurely would be unworthy of our hospitality. I propose a compromise: let them remain for a set time, say, a month. Then, if danger still looms, they must go for the village's protection." After some back and forth, this plan was adopted. Relief and sadness mingled in Magomed's heart. A month was a reprieve, but also a ticking clock. He couldn't deny that the settlement's caution was valid. After all, he had already seen how easily conspirators could manipulate events. For now, he accepted the council's decision with humility. In the days that followed, he continued teaching quietly, never insisting that villagers attend his sessions. If they came of their own accord. Some evenings, the circle around the fire grew surprisingly large. Villagers recounted their own interpretations of faith, mixing old folk traditions with scraps of Islamic knowledge handed down through generations. Magomed listened without condescension, offering clarifications when asked. Little by little, a sense of shared exploration emerged. To some, it felt like a new dawn, a kind of spiritual synergy that transcended the city's stifling politics. Uncle Farid observed from a cautious distance. Though he admired the unity forming, he worried about the settlement's safety. Nevertheless, the daily cooperation brought tangible results: new irrigation channels, stronger fences, a deeper well. Many credited these improvements to the extra hands and unifying influence of Magomed's group. For each weary villager, it became harder to ignore that something wholesome had been sparked here. But no human endeavor, especially one that hinged on precarious acceptance, could remain free of tension. Some villagers grew jealous, claiming the newcomers received too much credit. Others feared that too much emphasis on new religious perspectives might undermine local customs. A few insisted that the settlement had survived for years without outside teachers and didn't need foreign theology messing with their ways. Rumblings of disagreement simmered beneath the surface. Magomed recognized the signs of emerging strife. He'd seen it before in the city. Once people began to question their norms, old power structures felt threatened. He tried to defuse tensions by encouraging respect for each individual's journey. The Quran doesn't demand uniformity of culture, he would say. It calls for sincerity and compassion. We can learn from each other without discarding good traditions. Still, rumors of approaching trouble persisted. One scorching afternoon, a traveling peddler arrived with news that the city's officials had begun dispatching patrols to outlying regions. Their goal was to quell any rumored gatherings of Magomed's followers. Whispers abounded that certain unscrupulous bounty hunters roamed the countryside, hoping to capture Magomed for a handsome reward. Fear rippled through the settlement anew. Some argued that they should forcibly expel Magomed before outside forces arrived, lest the entire village be branded as complicit. Others insisted that turning him away would be an act of cowardice, a betrayal of the hospitality they had already shown. Uncle Farid, seeing both sides, opted for a cautious wait-and-see approach, but the atmosphere soured with anxiety. Sensing the weight of this dread, Magomed convened a meeting with his own companions. "We've stayed long enough to recover our strength," he said, voice tinged with regret. "Perhaps we should move on before we draw calamity upon these people." Layla, eyes brimming with tears, objected. "But we've done so much good here, and the villagers are opening their hearts. Are we to uproot ourselves again?" Rashid, though stiffer than usual from his partially healed wound, nodded in agreement. Leaving might confirm their worst fears. If trouble finds them anyway, they'll have lost us as allies. Kareem folded his arms. "But if we stay and soldiers come, what then? Bloodshed? We risk everything we've built and the villagers risk their homes." Magomed looked around at the ring of anxious faces. He understood that no solution was without peril. "We must do what preserves life and faith," he murmured. "We do not want another riot or confrontation. The question is whether our leaving will truly save them from the city's oppression or if we might stand together." Eventually, they decided on a middle path. They would remain, but prepare discreetly for a potential evacuation. If the threat became too great, they would depart willingly, praying that their gestures of goodwill would at least earn them safe passage. Meanwhile, they would continue contributing to the settlement, hoping the villagers would see that their presence did more good than harm. In the twilight that evening, as Magomed knelt by the well, Uncle Farid approached. The older man's posture was subdued. "This village has seen its share of hardship. Drought, raiders, sickness. We endure because we look after each other. I see that your people do the same. Yet the shadow of the city is long." Magomed rose, dusting off his hands. "I wish we could guarantee safety, but we have no illusions about the city's intentions." Uncle Farid nodded, gazing into the distance where the mountains stood silhouetted against a dusky sky. "We'll do what we can. You have proven yourselves. If trouble comes, I'll stand before the council and say you're not a threat. But I'm old. My voice is not what it once was." A wave of gratitude warmed Magomed's chest. "Your support means more than you know. Even if we must leave eventually, I hope these weeks of cooperation will not be forgotten." The old man said nothing but placed a calloused hand on Magomed's shoulder briefly, a rare gesture of solidarity. Then he shuffled away, leaving Magomed to ponder how fleeting alliances could be in a world so driven by fear and power. Time passed in a hush of uneasy anticipation. The tension in the village was a silent undertow, never breaking the surface but always present. Meanwhile, Magomed and his companions did their best to remain discreet. Teaching sessions continued in smaller, more private gatherings, avoiding large crowds that might give the impression of a growing movement. They didn't want to replicate the amphitheater scenario that had ended so disastrously in the city. Ironically, the more they tried to keep a low profile, the more some villagers sought them out in curiosity. A handful of youths asked Magomed to teach them to read Arabic so they could better understand the Qur'an. A few wives of village elders requested advice on reconciling local customs with certain religious principles. Magomed approached each interaction with humility, framing his insights as suggestions rather than commands. If the settlement faced a reckoning with outside forces, he wanted it to be clear that they had not imposed their beliefs by coercion. Still, the ominous news drifted in from the occasional traveler or peddler. City patrols were indeed scouring the region. Some small hamlets had already been visited and questioned about harboring fugitives. The bounties for Magomed's capture grew with each rumor. Like a gathering storm, the threat felt inevitable. One morning, a young shepherd came rushing into the village, breathless with alarm. He had seen armed riders on the horizon heading this way. Panic erupted. Men hurried to check the meager defenses, women hid valuables. The shepherd insisted he recognized the city's emblem on one of the riders' cloaks. At once, Uncle Farid and the elders summoned Magomed. Their stern faces betrayed a mixture of betrayal and fear. "You see what's coming?" one elder demanded. "We can't fight soldiers. If you don't leave now, they'll assume we're complicit." Anguish twisted Magomed's features. He remembered Surah 4:47, reminding him not to forsake the truth even when challenged. But was leaving a betrayal, or was staying a reckless act that could destroy these people's home? Layla touched Magomed's arm. "They're right," she said softly. "We can't drag them into a battle they never sought." Rashid turned to the elders. "We'll go, but we need a little time to gather our things." The tension was palpable as everyone scattered to prepare. Magomed's group rushed to pack their makeshift tents, their few supplies, and whatever meager rations they had. A swirl of fear and heartbreak clouded their movements. Some villagers watched with grim relief, others with sorrow, and still others with a distant, uncomprehending sadness that it had come to this. But time was short. The armed riders were only a few miles away. If they arrived to find Magomed's group still present, chaos could ensue. Uncle Farid hobbled to Magomed, pressing a small pouch of dried dates into his hands. "Take these," he said quietly. "I'll tell them you passed through long ago." Magomed bowed his head in gratitude. "Thank you, Uncle. May God bless you and this village for your kindness." In haste, they set off, following a narrow path through the rugged hills beyond the valley. Their footsteps stumbled over rocks as they hurried. The child in Layla's arms whimpered, sensing the fear pulsing through the adults. Behind them, the settlement receded into the distance, an almost wistful image of huts and farmland. The last sight Magomed had was of Uncle Farid standing in the central clearing, staff in hand, his expression unreadable. They pressed on, hearts pounding with urgency. Once they crested the ridge, the valley was lost from view. A weary sense of déjà vu overcame them. They were outcasts again, refugees in search of a safe horizon. Some in the group couldn't hold back tears at having to abandon yet another fragile home. Yet not all was despair. They had escaped unscathed for now. And they still had each other. The memory of what they had accomplished in that village, improving wells, forging friendships, sharing faith, reminded them that even short-lived sanctuaries could bear fruit. Perhaps the villagers would reflect on the lessons learned, the seeds planted in their hearts. In that sense, no act done sincerely in the name of truth was ever truly lost. Thus onward they trudged, setting their faces against the desert wind once more. Sand swirled around their ankles as they picked their way through a rocky pass. Magomed walked at the front, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuers. Surah 4:47 pulsed in his thoughts, a refrain that urged perseverance in the face of worldly resistance. If adversity was the cost of staying true, so be it. The path of a believer had never been meant to be easy. And so their journey continued, forging a parable of unwavering faith in an era that scorned simplicity. Each step away from the valley was a testament to the resilience of conviction, the refusal to abandon a truth once recognized. Whether they found another haven or drifted indefinitely, none could say. Yet in every prayer, in every act of shared compassion, they reaffirmed that Islam's call to embrace the light of the Qur'an and not turn away was stronger than any desert wind or city decree. For the moment, all that lay ahead was an open horizon, shimmering with both danger and possibility. Still, they walked. They pressed farther into the wilderness, flanked by rugged hills that stretched in every direction like the ribs of a great beast. Loose stones clattered beneath their sandals. A fierce wind caught at their cloaks, threatening to unbalance them on steep inclines. Overhead, the sun blazed white-hot, until sweat bathed even those who had grown accustomed to desert heat. Yet no one dared slow for long. The prospect of being caught by the armed riders who might be following their trail kept their legs moving. Rashid, grimacing with every step, touched the wound on his side. It had mostly healed, but strain and limited rations left him perpetually weary. Layla, holding the young child close, glanced back periodically, torn between fear and a flicker of hope that perhaps, for once, no pursuers lurked beyond the horizon. Magomed kept his eyes on the path ahead, guiding them through the narrow defile that promised a chance to vanish among the rocky labyrinth. Even though it had been only hours since they'd abandoned the valley settlement, it felt like days. The sting of parting from what could have been a peaceful home weighed on them all. Each had glimpsed the possibility of a life not defined by running, tending goats, refining an irrigation channel, teaching children the Arabic letters so they could read the Qur'an. That glimmer of normalcy made the fresh reality of exile all the more bitter. Yet they pressed on, spurred by necessity. By late afternoon, they crested a rocky pass. Below stretched an expanse of rolling dunes interspersed with patches of scraggly vegetation. The dunes shifted in color from pale gold to rusty orange, undulating like a restless ocean of sand. Immediately, the group recognized a harsh truth. Crossing a desert so vast, with meager supplies, was a gamble against nature itself. But turning back was unthinkable. Magomed raised a hand for a halt. The others collapsed onto nearby rocks, panting. A hush hung over them, broken only by the whistling wind. Karim rubbed grit from his eyes. I'm not sure how much farther we can push ourselves today. Magomed looked at the sun's angle. We'll have to make camp as soon as we find a suitable spot, he said softly. We have limited water. If we push too hard, we'll risk collapsing. Rashid exhaled shakily. We're nearing the real desert now, not just these foothills. He cast a troubled glance at the child in Layla's arms. We have to be cautious. A single dust storm could end us. Despite the grim situation, Layla offered a small, determined nod. We have endured so much. Perhaps God will provide a way again. Let's keep going a little more. We can't stay on this high ground, exposed to every pair of eyes. No one disputed her. Renewing their resolve, they descended from the pass, slipping and sliding on loose gravel. The path dissolved into a patch of parched earth that flaked underfoot, then gave way to sandy ridges that meandered unpredictably. The sun's heat felt more oppressive at lower altitude. Their throats dried out quickly. Each mouthful of water had to be rationed like precious jewels. As twilight edged across the sky, they stumbled onto a small hollow where tall rocks formed a partial enclosure. Low shrubs huddled against the outcrops, hinting at possible moisture beneath the sand. The group decided that would be their night's refuge. They set down their bundles, massaged aching limbs, and divided tasks. Gathering kindling, arranging sleeping spots, checking for any hint of water under the rocks. A few scrawny lizards scuttled away when they disturbed the shrubs, but there was no sign of any larger threat. Night came swiftly, along with a sharp drop in temperature. Magomed and a few others assembled a cautious fire, small enough to minimize its glow, yet sufficient to warm them. Orange embers cast flickering shadows on the rocky walls, giving the hollow a sense of intimacy despite the open sky above. They shared what little food they had, morsels of dried fruit, a few strips of salted meat, and bits of hard flatbread that tasted of dust. Hunger gnawed at them, yet they forced themselves to leave some stores untouched, aware that the journey ahead might be even longer. Once the meager meal ended, an exhausted hush blanketed the camp. It was in that hush that Magomed knelt to pray, turning his heart to the one who had guided them all along. As he finished his supplications, Rashid eased himself onto a flat stone next to Magomed. Do you think they found us gone when they reached the valley? He asked quietly, eyes distant with worry. Magomed nodded, setting his gaze on the shimmering stars. Likely. The villagers are resourceful. Uncle Farid will claim we vanished days ago, but I fear they'll still pay a price. The city's men might demand an investigation or tributes. I can only pray we haven't brought them harm. Rashid's jaw tightened. They made their choice to shelter us, even if it was only for a while. Sometimes I wonder if Surah 447 calls for unwavering faith even when it leads to trouble for others. Is that fair? Magomed considered for a moment. It's less about causing trouble for others and more about refusing to lie about what is right, he said gently. We never asked them to fight on our behalf, only to let us exist there in peace. The city's aggression is a reflection of their own fear, not ours. Yet I too feel the guilt. It seems wherever we go, oppression follows. They lapsed into silence. In that silence, a faint breeze carried the memory of times when Islam took root in hardship, the early Muslims in Mecca, or those who found refuge in Abyssinia. Magomed often pondered these parallels, and he knew Rashid did too. Faith thrived under adversity, but the cost in human suffering was immense. Eventually, most of the group settled to sleep, curling up against rocks or using cloth bundles as pillows. A couple of them, Karim included, kept watch, scanning the moonlit dunes for silhouettes that might indicate pursuing riders. Magomed dozed fitfully, lulled by exhaustion, only to surface with each gust of wind that whined around the stone enclosure. At some indeterminate hour, he woke to a hushed commotion. He blinked, heart hammering. Two figures hovered near the fire's dying embers. It was Layla and one of the younger men, whispering urgently. Sensing trouble, Magomed rose and quietly approached. The younger man's face was etched with alarm. "She's not breathing well," he murmured, pointing to a small figure curled in Layla's arms. Magomed realized it was the child, who looked feverish under the moonlight. The boy's tiny chest rose and fell in shallow rasps, and his eyes fluttered as if caught in a nightmare. Magomed knelt, pressing the back of his hand to the child's forehead. "He's burning," Magomed whispered. "Must be the desert heat, exhaustion, or both." Layla's eyes brimmed with tears. "I tried giving him water and letting him rest, but he can't hold anything down. I'm worried he might not survive a trek through the dunes if this fever doesn't break." Magomed's stomach lurched. He'd known the perils of traveling with a child, but seeing it firsthand was agonizing. "We need to cool him somehow. Let's find any water we can spare." But their water supply was dangerously low, meant primarily for drinking. They rummaged through the group's containers, collecting only a small pouch of leftover water. Layla dampened a cloth and placed it gently against the boy's forehead, hoping the night air would help ease his temperature. All they could do was pray. Rashid joined them, arms folded over his chest, face grim. "If the fever worsens, we may have to stop traveling for a day or two, find a spring somewhere, or we'll lose him." The prospect felt like a boulder on Magomed's shoulders. Stopping could give the city's men time to catch up. Pressing on could kill the child. He stared at the stars. "We'll see how he is at daybreak," Magomed murmured. "We can't push him too hard." They huddled in uneasy vigil for what remained of the night. The child's breathing was ragged, but he clung to life with the stubborn resilience that sometimes graces the young. By the time dawn's first light crawled over the dunes, he'd slipped into a fitful sleep, limbs trembling against Layla's side. When the rest of the group stirred, gloom tugged at the edges of their spirits. One by one, they noticed the child's condition. No one asked whether they should move on. The answer was plain in the sorrowful glances they exchanged. Kareem, scanning the dunes for danger, grimaced. "We can't linger long, but I won't argue with the need to save a life. Let us pray no soldiers find us here." So they established a makeshift sickbed in the shade of a high rock outcropping. Layla stayed by the child's side, whispering bits of Quranic verses in hope that divine mercy might soothe him. Rashid and two others ventured cautiously into the surrounding area, searching for any sign of water, maybe an underground spring or a hidden trickle. Magomed offered a prayer of healing, voice low and fervent, recalling the Quranic reminders that in God's hands lay all remedy and relief. The hours crawled. The desert sun grew punishing. The men returned empty-handed, faces streaked with sweat. "There's no water source nearby," Rashid reported. "Just sand and a few rocks. We'd need to go much farther north or circle back to the foothills, but that's out of the question." His voice sounded strangled with frustration. Kareem let out a heavy sigh. "If the fever doesn't subside soon, we'll have to press forward and hope the next oasis is close enough. Maybe if we travel by night." Magomed glanced at Layla, who looked exhausted, eyes ringed with worry. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "He's barely conscious now. Night travel might be our only chance, but moving him in this state." She shook her head, tears forming. "I'm scared." Magomed's heart twisted. "We'll do everything we can. Let's wait until the sun drops. Keep applying cool cloths. In the meantime, everyone else, rest if you can. We'll need energy for the night march." Agreeing on that plan, they passed the day in subdued silence, each lost in thoughts of the precariousness of life out here. A handful of them recited the Qur'an softly, searching for courage. Others dozed fitfully, rousing intermittently to check for riders or to see if the boy's condition had changed. Surah 447 echoed in Magomed's mind, reminding him that he must cling to faith even amid grim circumstances. He had taught so many about trusting in God's mercy, but how to reconcile that with the heartbreak of a child fighting for breath in the desert? Twilight arrived in a slow blaze of pink and gold across the horizon. The group mustered what little vigor they had, packing their things under the dimming sky. Layla cradled the boy, who opened his eyes briefly, as though startled to be moved. He let out a weak whimper that made her throat tighten. They had no choice but to go on. Staying meant dehydration for them all, or being found by those who hunted Magomed. With the sun gone and the moon yet to rise, they set off into deepening shadows, footsteps muffled by the sand. The child's feverish whimpers occasionally broke the hush, sending pangs of anxiety through the group. Rashid led the way, guided by distant stars, aiming to keep a northerly course. Magomed hovered near Layla, ready to help if the child's condition worsened. Night in the desert was a different kind of trial. The temperature plummeted so drastically that they shivered, even as they tried to maintain a steady pace. The dunes looked eerily uniform in the faint starlight, each ridge as likely to lead nowhere as the next. More than once, they had to backtrack, sliding down loose slopes, hearts pounding at the sensation of movement in the dark. As they advanced, they found a plateau of hard-packed earth that allowed quicker progress, though it scraped at their worn sandals. Occasionally, Magomed would pause to listen for the echo of hoofbeats or the jingle of tack. Any sign of riders, but the night remained still, save for the low moan of wind across the sand. Hours bled together. The child's breathing became shallower. Layla began to fall behind, legs trembling under the strain of carrying him. Concerned, Karim took a turn holding the boy for a while, though he was no less weary. They pressed on in grim determination, no one daring to mention the possibility that the child might slip away before dawn. At last, an ashen grayness touched the eastern sky. The group felt their lungs burn and their legs quiver, exhausted from a night's march. With the approach of dawn, the temperature would soon soar again, forcing them to seek shelter. "Over there," Rashid croaked, pointing to a low hill that might offer a windbreak. They trudged to it, each step an ordeal. By the time they collapsed in the hill's meager shadow, they were too spent to speak. Layla cradled the boy, eyes red with tears. "He's so hot," she whispered. "He's not waking." The child's face was flushed, lips cracked. A wave of desperation rippled through the group. "Water," Magomed said urgently, glancing around. "Anyone have any left?" With trembling hands, they pooled their remaining water. It was barely half a skin. Magomed dipped a rag into it, pressing it to the boy's brow and lips. "Drink, little one," he murmured. But the child's mouth scarcely responded, his eyes half-lidded. No one spoke for a long time. Even in adversity, they had found ways to encourage each other, but this felt different, like a final reckoning with how fragile humans were in the face of nature. Magomed shut his eyes, whispering a fervent prayer. They had done all they could, but it might not be enough. He recalled Surah 447 yet again, reflecting that part of not turning away from truth meant accepting the reality that sometimes outcomes lay outside one's control. The sun climbed. Heat draped itself over them in suffocating waves. They rigged a rudimentary canopy from blankets and sticks, shielding Layla and the boy as best they could. The rest sprawled around, forming a forlorn circle. No one dared to sleep deeply. Fear and dread gnawed at them like wild animals. Midday passed in a haze. The child seemed to linger on the edge between life and death, occasionally letting out weak moans. Layla's tears dried on her cheeks, replaced by a numbness that Magomed recognized as a sign of exhaustion. The entire group, stifled by the furnace-like air and the specter of tragedy, hardly stirred. Then, sometime in the late afternoon, a faint call echoed in the desert stillness. At first, they thought it was the wind, but then it came again, a distant human voice. Alarmed, Rashid struggled to his feet. He peered across the sands. Over a dune crest, silhouettes wavered in the shimmering heat. Could it be the soldiers? Karim jumped up, shielding his eyes with a hand. "They're on foot," he observed. "And they look like they're carrying bundles. Not exactly how city patrols travel." Magomed's pulse quickened. "Stay alert. We don't know their intentions." Yet secretly, he felt a spark of hope that maybe these strangers carried water or medicine. At this point, any help, no matter how uncertain, would be a blessing. As the shapes drew closer, they resolved into 3 individuals. 2 men and a woman, each with a donkey laden with sacks. Their clothes were simple, sun-bleached. When they noticed Magomed's group crouched beneath the makeshift canopy, they stopped at a respectful distance and exchanged a few words among themselves. Finally, the older man lifted a hand in greeting. Rashid, too exhausted for caution, waved them over. The travelers approached slowly, eyes flicking between the ragged band and the limp child. One of the new arrivals, a tall, lean woman with a weathered face, spoke in a gentle tone. "Peace be upon you. You look in need of help." The relief in those words was almost painful. Magomed nodded, forcing his voice not to tremble. "Peace be upon you as well. Yes, we have a sick child and little water." Immediately, the travelers swung into action. The older man unslung a goatskin of water while the woman rummaged through her donkey's pack for a clay jar that smelled vaguely medicinal. "We're herbalists," she explained. "We roam these regions, trading remedies and simple cures. Let me see the child." Layla relinquished the boy into the woman's arms with a desperate look. The woman knelt, checking the child's pulse, temperature, and the dryness of his skin. "He's severely dehydrated and burning with fever. We can try to bring it down." Carefully, she soaked a cloth with the water, pressed it to the child's lips, and dribbled a bit into his mouth. Then she measured out a dark liquid from the clay jar. "Sip this, little one," she murmured. "It's bitter, but it might help." The boy stirred, letting out a small whimper before swallowing. Layla grasped Magomed's arm, tears rekindling. Magomed whispered, "May God reward you." To the strangers, "We feared he wouldn't last the day." The older man shook his head. "You shouldn't be crossing this expanse without proper supplies. Where are you heading?" Rashid and Karim exchanged glances. They had no clear answer. "Away from trouble," Rashid admitted. "We lost our place in the city, lost our place in a village, and now we wander. We're not sure where we'll end up." A gentle sympathy touched the herbalist woman's eyes. "I see. Well, there's a caravan route some miles east of here. If you can get there, you might find rest at a caravanserai. It's not exactly welcoming to fugitives, but travelers do gather. You might pass unnoticed if you wish." Karim managed a wry smile. "We've grown adept at passing unnoticed, but not so adept at surviving the desert." With cautious generosity, the travelers offered to share some water and a portion of their herbal supply. They warned that their own reserves were limited, but they would not leave a child to die. Magomed's group, overcome with gratitude, thanked them profusely. The tall woman gave instructions on how to continue caring for the boy. Keep his head cool, let him drink small amounts frequently, feed him the bitter tincture if his fever spiked again. Night fell as they conversed in halting, weary tones. The 3 herbalists, 2 siblings and their cousin, it turned out, planned to depart at first light. They had their own route to follow, villages to visit, and trade to conduct. "But come," the older man insisted. "Share in our meal tonight. We have enough for both groups." Even that small invitation felt like a miracle. They pooled resources, cooking a thin porridge enriched by the herbalist's herbs. The fragrance was both savory and medicinal, promising some measure of sustenance beyond the meager scraps Magomed's group had carried. Gathered around a new fire, they ate by moonlight. Rashid was too spent to do more than grunt in approval of the warm food, and Layla barely left the child's side, feeding him spoonfuls whenever he stirred. Yet the atmosphere felt unexpectedly hopeful, as though the meeting had lit a small lantern of possibility in the darkness. The herbalist woman, whose name was Mina, eventually turned to Magomed. "You speak softly, but I sense something in your bearing, like you're a leader or a teacher." He glanced at his companions. "I've tried to remind people of the Quran's call to moral responsibility," he replied quietly, "especially the warning in Surah 447, that once the truth has reached us, we must not turn away." Mina's brow furrowed with interest. "And that's why you're running?" Magomed sighed, the lines of fatigue etched deep on his face. "In a manner of speaking, some in power see that call as a threat. So we keep moving, seeking a place where we can live by our faith without condemnation. She nodded thoughtfully. My father used to say that a clear conscience is always a threat to those who benefit from confusion. Perhaps you're not so different from us wandering herbalists, just trying to mend what's broken. Her words, spoken so simply, moved Magomed more than she might have known. He lifted his gaze to the wide sky. A scattering of stars blinked above, reminders of the infinite space beyond human strife. Thank you, he murmured. We often feel alone out here. After they finished eating, they set up a more stable canopy for the child. He had managed a few spoonfuls of water and porridge, and though still perilously weak, he seemed calmer. Layla looked on with fresh tears. This time, tears of relief that he might have a fighting chance. Throughout the night, both groups kept vigil. The herbalists dozed in turns, occasionally waking to check on the child or feed the fire. Magomed couldn't fully relax, his thoughts sliding between gratitude for these strangers and anxiety about what lay ahead. Surah 447 pulsed in his heart, almost like a lullaby and a warning in one. He reminded himself over and over that adversity did not mean abandonment, merely a test of who would persevere in the path of moral truth. Dawn revealed a reluctant hope. The boy's fever had subsided slightly. He opened his eyes for a moment, blinking at the pale light. Layla let out a quiet sob, pressing her forehead to his. The entire group exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for days. Even the herbalists smiled, though they cautioned that his condition remained fragile. True to their word, the siblings and cousin prepared to depart early. Before they left, Mina scribbled directions in the sand, showing how to reach the caravan route. You'll see a large outcrop shaped like a camel's hump, she explained. From there, follow the trail east until you find a well. There should be a caravansary not far beyond that. Magomed and Rashid memorized every detail. Then, with further blessings and thanks exchanged, the two groups parted ways, one continuing westward towards scattered desert villages, the other setting out across the dunes, guided by the hope of finding a place where they could replenish supplies and rest. The child, though still frail, clung to Layla's neck, occasionally sipping water. Felt like a precious victory. They walked at a measured pace, the sunlight intensifying as the morning advanced. In better shape now that they'd had a proper meal, each of them found renewed will to endure. The dunes still posed challenges, hot, shifting, and unpredictable, but they pressed on with the promise of a well somewhere ahead. By midday, the heat became oppressive again. Remembering the herbalist's advice, they sought a shady spot beneath a rocky ledge, waiting out the worst hours. The child slept fitfully, but his breathing was stronger than the day before. Layla murmured soft prayers over him, her gratitude more profound than any comfort she might have felt in the city or the valley settlement. At last, the afternoon sun slanted across the dunes, signaling that they could resume without risking sunstroke. Guided by Mina's directions, Rashid kept scanning the horizon for the distinctive camel's hump rock formation. It finally appeared in the distance, faint but unmistakable. Spurred by hope, they quickened their steps, ignoring the burning in their calves. Upon reaching the outcrop, they paused to consult the rough map in their memories. East then toward a well. The shadows grew long, painting the desert with dramatic shapes. Magomed inhaled the cooler evening air, half expecting to see city riders gallop into view. But the dunes remained still, an indifferent witness to their struggle. Soon, the ground became firmer and flatter, scattered with gravel rather than deep sand. This was a sign of a common path, worn by countless hooves and feet over the years. Sure enough, faint tracks emerged, cartwheels, footprints, camel prints. A wave of relief rippled through the group. They had found the caravan route. Night fell swiftly in the desert, and they spotted the glow of torches or lamps some distance away. Approaching cautiously, they beheld a low-walled compound surrounded by tethered animals and cargo. A few tents had been pitched off to one side. Figures moved about, some clad in robes, others in more elaborate traveler's attire. The odor of dung and cooking fires mingled with the crisp scent of desert evening. A caravansary, Karim breathed. We might find water, supplies, maybe even acceptance. But his tone carried the weight of uncertainty. After all, the city's influence could lurk anywhere. Magomed led them forward. As they neared, a stern-faced guard with a spear hailed them. Who goes there? Rashid raised both hands in a peaceful gesture. Travelers in need of rest. We have a sick child. He glanced at Layla, who stood behind him, the boy leaning weakly on her shoulder. The guard grimaced, his eyes flicking over their ragged clothing. We've had many wanderers recently, bandits too. What proof you aren't thieves? Karim stepped up, removing a small carved token from his belt, a keepsake from the village, marking him as a laborer and caretaker of goats. We have nothing of value but our honesty, he said. We seek only water and a corner to rest. A moment passed in tense silence before the guard stepped aside with a curt nod. Speak to the caravansary keeper inside the walls. He decides who gets lodging. Within, the compound revealed a cluttered yard of crates, tethered horses, and bleary-eyed merchants who nodded warily at the newcomers. A central building of mud brick stood near a well, around which a handful of travelers filled skins or chatted in hushed tones. The air smelled of spices and sweat, thick with the undertones of business and caution that always accompanied trade routes. Magomed approached a stout man with a leathery face and a wide mustache, likely the keeper. Peace be upon you, Magomed began, inclining his head. We are weary travelers, fleeing trouble in the south. May we have permission to rest here for the night? The keeper squinted at them, calculating. What trouble? We encountered violence, Magomed said diplomatically. We mean no harm to anyone. We have a child who's very ill. The man grunted, eyeing the child. We don't turn away the sick, but we charge a modest fee for water and space. He named a price, which prompted anxious glances among Magomed's group. They had few coins left, mostly gleaned from small trades or leftover from the city. Still, they pooled what they had, relieved it sufficed. All right, the keeper said, pocketing their meager silver pieces. You can bed down behind that stable. Keep to yourselves. We're expecting more caravans, and space is tight. Weak with gratitude, they followed his direction. Behind the stable, they found a tiny nook where some straw had been scattered. It smelled of animals and damp earth, but it was better than open desert. Moreover, water was within reach, clear, abundant water from the caravansary's well. Rashid filled a skin while Layla helped the boy drink carefully, pouring small sips into his mouth. His eyes fluttered open, and color returned to his cheeks. It felt like witnessing a miracle no less profound than any grand theological revelation. As they settled in, other travelers occasionally passed, casting curious or indifferent looks. One or two asked if they needed help, but most were busy with their own concerns. Negotiations, loading cargo, or preparing to depart at first light. A swirl of languages punctuated the yard, accents from distant lands, or so it seemed to Magomed, who recalled how Islam had spread far beyond its birthplace, uniting diverse peoples under the banner of belief in one God. Throughout the evening, they took turns washing off desert grime, gulping water, and nibbling on a small meal purchased from a vendor. The boy, for the first time in days, managed to eat bread softened with broth. Layla all but cried in relief when she finally laid him down on a makeshift bed of blankets. He slept more peacefully than any of them had seen in a while. Exhaustion eventually overwhelmed the entire band. They dozed in shifts, half expecting some official from the city to appear. But the night passed without incident. In the morning, the caravansary buzzed with commerce. A large caravan had arrived at dawn, filling the yard with crates of dates, spices, and textiles. Camels grunted, horses whinnied, men shouted instructions. Dust rose in swirling clouds. Magomed's group huddled at the edge of this bustle, feeling both invisible and strangely present in a microcosm of humanity's restless trade. Karim approached Magomed, frowning. We can't stay here long without money. The keeper will want more if we linger, and we'll run out of coins fast. Rashid nodded. Maybe we can find small work, loading crates, cleaning stalls, earn enough to move on. Layla, cradling the still recovering child, offered a hesitant suggestion. Or perhaps we discover a caravan heading north or east, somewhere away from the city's sphere. They might let us travel with them, so long as we can pay or help. Magomed gazed at the swirl of trade. Caravans often employed guards, animal handlers, or laborers. It might be their best chance to slip away from the city's domain entirely, maybe even to a distant region more tolerant of spiritual movements. But the question remained: who would hire a ragged band with meager skills and no references? They decided to try. Splitting up, Rashid, Karim, and Magomed moved through the yard, offering their labor to any caravan master who would listen. Karim demonstrated his skill with goats, but most caravans cared little for goats. Rashid displayed his strength, willing to haul cargo or stand guard, though he still bore signs of injury. Magomed volunteered to do menial tasks, cooking, cleaning, anything, while quietly explaining they were simply wanderers in need of honest work. Reactions varied. Some scoffed, suspecting them of being thieves. Others already had enough laborers. Still others demanded references or more silver in advance. By midday, the group had faced repeated rejections. Sweat dripped down Rashid's brow as he slumped against a crate. "We might have to keep searching," he muttered. "But we can't pay the caravansary keeper another night's fee." Before despair could fully set in, a slight, middle-aged merchant with a trimmed gray beard approached. He had observed their inquiries from a distance. "You lot, come here," he said, tone direct but not unkind. They gathered around him, warily hopeful. He looked them over. "I'm in need of extra hands." Headed northeast, across a desert route that leads to a coastal trading post. Karim brightened. "We'll take any work you offer, sir." The merchant scratched his chin. "I can't pay much, but if you help with the caravan, tend the animals, set up camp, cook whatever's needed, I'll cover your food and let you travel under my protection. I want no trouble, mind you." Rashid glanced at Magomed. Their eyes locked in a silent exchange. This might be their best shot. "No trouble," Rashid promised. "We're just thankful for the chance." "Fine," the merchant grunted. "We leave tomorrow at dawn. My name's Fayez. Report to me or my foreman for instructions. Don't cross us." He gave them a final searching look before striding away to supervise the loading of crates. Relief washed over them, though it was tinged with wariness. Traveling under the banner of a caravan would keep them from immediate suspicion, assuming Fayez didn't learn of Magomed's identity as a wanted teacher. For the moment, they accepted the risk. They returned to Layla and the child, breathless with something resembling optimism. "That's wonderful," Layla breathed, hugging the boy. "We'll be safer in a larger group." Magomed felt a subtle stirring inside his chest, something reminiscent of hope. The desert had tested them, the city had hunted them, the valley had forced them out, yet here was another thread of possibility. "Let us do our best to serve faithfully," he said, "and perhaps, in turn, we'll find a land where we can finally stop running." Throughout the rest of the day, they prepared for the journey, mending clothes, resting as much as possible, and carefully tending the child with the herbal remedies Mina had left them. By dusk, the caravansary courtyard calmed as travelers turned in. Magomed's group huddled in their corner, sharing a meager meal of rice and lentils. Despite the persistent fear of being recognized, they couldn't help but feel a cautious relief that tomorrow might bring a new start. Late into the night, Magomed sat awake, leaning against a stable wall. Surah 447 whispered through his mind again. He turned each phrase over in thought, reflecting on how many times it had accompanied him. Through the city's amphitheater, across the battered village, into the desert's merciless sweep, and now into a caravansary. Each stage reaffirmed the notion that truth, once internalized, became a guiding presence. To turn away was to deny not just moral duty but one's own essence. A warm breeze drifted by, carrying the smell of horses and straw. Somewhere, a camel groaned. In the distance, someone strummed a lute, a faint melody weaving through the night air. Magomed closed his eyes, letting the notes mingle with the hush of stars. Though the path had been brutal, faith remained. And tomorrow, They would walk that faith forward once more. This time as part of a caravan, heading into unknown lands with hearts still brimming with that unwavering pledge to honor the revelation entrusted to them. He thought of the child, now sleeping more peacefully than at any point in the last few days. He thought of Layla's gentleness, Rashid's courage, Kareem's quiet resilience, and the rest who had braved this journey. They had been tested at every turn, yet they hadn't let despair poison their resolve. If Surah 4:47's caution meant anything now, it was that they refused to pretend ignorance of the love and mercy that grounded their faith. They had seen miracles in small gestures. An oasis found at the right moment, a group of herbalists appearing from nowhere, or a merchant offering them a lifeline. The world was far from perfect, but those glimpses of grace reminded him that God's light persisted in every corner, if one only chose to see it. As the lute's melody faded, Magomed inhaled the stillness, heart brimming with gratitude despite all he had lost. If the next day brought danger, so be it. He would not meet it unprepared. And if it brought a chance to keep teaching, keep living the Quran's call, then all the wandering would be worthwhile. In the first pale shimmer of dawn, the caravan stirred, preparing to depart. Camels groaned as they were loaded, donkeys brayed, men barked orders in clipped voices. Fayez, standing at the center of it all, shouted instructions with the brisk authority of someone accustomed to the rigors of desert trade. Magomed and his companions scrambled to obey, lifting crates and tying them down. Every muscle protested from the trials of recent days, but they pressed on, determined not to disappoint the man who had given them this chance. The boy, still weak, rode on one of the calmer camels with Layla walking close by, guiding the reins. Rashid and Kareem divided tasks. One tended to hitching animals, the other checked the cargo for any signs of shifting. Magomed helped distribute water skins among the caravan workers. He caught murmurs about distant markets, about currency rates, about rumors of war or peace. The swirl of conversation made him marvel at how vast the world was beyond the city's narrow walls. Troubles and opportunities stretched in every direction, shaped by human ambition and divine decree. Soon, the caravan formed into a slow-moving line, departing the caravansary gate at sunrise. Dust rose beneath the hooves of pack animals. Merchants in fine robes mingled with hired guards whose swords gleamed in the morning light. Magomed and his group took up positions near the rear, content to be overlooked by most. Their hearts pounded with that familiar mix of anticipation and anxiety. Yet this time, it leaned more toward a cautious optimism. As they passed beyond the caravansary's perimeter, Magomed chanced a glance back. The yard, the stable, the well. They vanished behind a swirl of dust, blending into the dawn's glow. He realized with quiet conviction that they were stepping once again into an unknown chapter, guided only by faith and the belief that turning from the truth was never an option, no matter how treacherous the road. A faint breeze tugged at his robe, as though ushering him forward. He heard the gentle clank of pots and the low hum of travelers speaking a half-dozen languages. Surah 4:47 hovered at the edge of his consciousness, a luminous reminder of everything that had led him here. The desert rolled out before them, ridges of sand painted gold by the rising sun, beckoning them onward. And in that boundless expanse, Magomed felt the stirrings of renewed purpose, as if each grain of sand bore witness to the unwavering call that had shaped his life. To honor truth and never, under any threat, to abandon it. The caravan moved northward at a methodical pace, animals and travelers forming a winding line across the dunes. Golden sunlight turned the desert into a sea of shifting brightness, while the crisp morning air quickly gave way to a rising heat. Magomed and his group, Rashid, Layla and the child, Kareem and a few others, found themselves absorbed into the lively dance of trade and travel. Donkeys brayed, camels groaned beneath bulky loads, and hired guards rode at the flanks, alert for bandits or any lurking dangers. Their new employer, the merchant Fayez, proved taciturn but fair. He barked instructions in the early hours, expecting strict adherence to routine, the loading of crates, distribution of water, and maintenance of the animals. For Magomed's band, exhausted by endless wandering, it was enough simply to be part of something structured. Each night, they helped set up camp, pitched tents in neat rows, and tended cooking fires that glowed under the expansive desert sky. Despite the heavy workload and the persistent sense of vigilance, the arrangement brought them a small measure of comfort. In exchange for labor, they received meals, water, and the camouflage of traveling amid a far larger group. With so many merchants, porters, and guards in the caravan, it was easier to pass unnoticed. A casual observer would see only another band of hired hands, lost in the bustle of commerce. Layla's child, though still frail, began to recover in earnest. Thanks to the rest and the water they could now freely access, his fever receded day by day. Layla was often seen murmuring prayers, gently cradling his head whenever they stopped, giving thanks to God that he had survived the desert's trials. On cooler nights, the boy even toddled around the edges of the campsite, timidly exploring, while Layla or Kareem supervised. Each small step felt like a testament to renewed life. Magomed, for his part, remained vigilant in more ways than one. While hauling supplies or distributing food, he listened carefully to the chatter around the fires. Caravans, by their nature, gathered people from many regions, all bringing scraps of news. He heard rumors of warring clans in distant provinces, whispers of a new ruler rising somewhere beyond the mountains, and scattered talk of religious disputes in certain cities. The mention of a fugitive preacher occasionally surfaced, but never with any specific details that tied back to him. Still, every fragment of gossip reminded Magomed how precarious his position remained. Surah 447, the verse that had shaped his mission, echoed in his mind whenever he felt the tug of uncertainty. If God's truth was an unyielding guidepost, then a believer could not simply vanish into anonymity forever. Sooner or later, that truth demanded witness. Yet for now, their priority was survival and safeguarding the battered faith of those who had journeyed with him. He kept his teachings subdued, confining them to late-night whispers with his companions, or to those curious souls in the caravan who asked discreet questions. Rashid sometimes watched Magomed with concern. One evening, under the pale light of the moon, he approached while Magomed sat cross-legged by a smoldering campfire. "You've been awfully quiet these past days," Rashid said gently, taking a seat nearby. "Are you still wrestling with guilt over the village?" Magomed's shoulders slumped slightly. "Partly," he admitted. "I wonder what became of them, whether the city's men harassed them further. But more than that, I keep asking myself how to continue the calling that led us here in the first place. We're traveling as laborers, not as teachers. Should I be doing more to share the guidance that Surah 447 offers?" Rashid glanced around. Most members of the caravan were already dozing, except for a few guards and a merchant finishing his ledger by lantern light. "We barely escaped with our lives," Rashid replied. "For now, I think it's enough that we keep our flame alive privately. Not every moment requires open preaching." Magomed nodded, recognizing the truth of it. Still, the world is so vast. Surely there must be a corner where people are prepared to hear that ignoring truth harms only themselves. If only we knew where that corner might be. Rashid smiled wryly. "I'm sure God knows. We can trust that, when the time is right, you'll know it too." They lapsed into a companionable silence, letting the nighttime desert wind draw away the day's heat. Overhead, the constellations gleamed with a clarity that reminded them of creation's immensity. In that calm, Magomed felt a delicate thread of assurance that, for all the hardships behind them, their journey was not aimless. In the days and weeks that followed, Magomed's tireless dedication to fairness and kindness quietly made an impression among a handful of fellow travelers. When two porters argued over the distribution of water, Magomed intervened gently, citing the Prophet's teaching on brotherhood in Islam, that the best among you is the one who wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself. Some who overheard were struck by the serenity in his voice, the sense that he carried an inner light despite his humble appearance. Likewise, when a merchant's donkey injured its leg on rocky terrain, Magomed spent hours assisting with rudimentary bandaging, offering soothing recitations from the Qur'an to calm the animal. That merchant's guard later approached him in private, wanting to learn more about the verses he had cited. Though Magomed still hesitated to step into a teacher's role openly, he shared a few passages, speaking of compassion as an extension of faith, of how Surah 447 admonished believers not to shut their ears once truth had reached them in any form. Word of these small acts spread in quiet ripples. Some shrugged it off, chalking it up to a simple laborer with unusual piety. Others became curious, especially those from distant lands who recognized different languages or sets of beliefs. The caravan was, in many ways, a roving tapestry of human diversity. Magomed found glimpses of hope there, reminders that Islam, at its best, transcended borders and backgrounds. Still, he tread carefully. Fayez, the merchant sponsoring them, seemed indifferent to religion, focused primarily on ensuring smooth logistics. Whenever he noticed people crowding near Magomed, he'd bark at them to return to their tasks. He had no desire to encourage any gatherings that might disrupt the caravan schedule. "You're a good worker," Fayez told Magomed one afternoon, "but I won't have you stirring up debates among my crew, understood? We have a tight route to keep." Magomed bowed his head. "Of course, sir. I don't seek to disrupt anything. We only wish to do our job faithfully." The older man grunted and strode off, evidently satisfied. That was how Magomed managed the delicate balance, offering gentle counsel whenever asked, but refraining from anything that might look like proselytizing. He reasoned that, for now, living the teachings consistently might speak more loudly than open sermons. The caravan's path led them through alternating stretches of rocky plains and dunes, each day bringing fresh challenges. One morning, they woke to find that several of Fayez's camels had gone missing, likely spooked by a nocturnal predator or undone by careless hobbling. Tensions flared, as the loss of valuable animals threatened the schedule. Magomed and Rashid volunteered to search, combing the area at sunrise. After hours of tracking footprints, they found the camels huddled near a patch of shrubs, braying in confusion. With great relief, they herded them back, earning a rare nod of gratitude from Fayez. Another time, a dust storm blew in without warning, turning midday into a chaotic swirl of stinging sand. Visibility dropped to an arm's length, and the caravan scrambled to protect their faces and keep the animals calm. Magomed's group, still haunted by memories of the earlier desert storm that nearly killed them, felt terror clutch at their throats. They clung to each other, forming a chain so no one would be lost. After an hour of howling winds, the storm passed, leaving the travelers shaken but intact. In the aftermath, Magomed led a quick head count and discovered that, mercifully, no one was missing. Even with these challenges, the caravan pressed on, forging a collective resilience. Nights became gatherings around multiple fires, each ring of people cooking and conversing in their own style. Occasionally, a traveling musician produced a reed flute or a stringed instrument, weaving melodies that drifted across the sands. In such moments, one could almost forget the dangers lurking beyond the circle of firelight. Layla's child, though still easily tired, gained enough strength to totter between the campsites, sometimes coaxing a smile from even the gruffest guard. The little one's survival carried symbolic weight for those who knew their story. More than once, a traveler new to the caravan asked Layla how she managed to keep him alive in the harsh desert. She would simply look toward Magomed and the others and reply, "By God's grace, and by these friends who refused to abandon us." Such unity did not mean the caravan was free of moral pitfalls. Fayez's trade was profitable, and some guards found entertainment in gambling or in the dubious wares carried by certain opportunistic merchants. Late into the night, wagers took place by lantern light, money changing hands in the shadows. On more than one occasion, heated quarrels erupted, nearly leading to fights. Once, Rashid stumbled upon a group of men brawling behind a tent. Apparently, one accused the other of cheating at dice. Rashid tried to intervene, only to be shoved aside. He returned to Magomed with a split lip, outraged that such petty vice thrived here. Magomed cautioned him that confronting these men too openly might backfire. "We cannot force them to see the truth," he said softly. "We can only exemplify a different way. Besides, the caravan's hierarchy tolerates these practices. Challenging them head-on could spark trouble." Rashid winced but nodded. I just hate seeing greed and deception flourish. After all we've faced, it seems so pointless. Magomed sighed. It does. Yet humans have always grappled with such temptations. Islam teaches us to guard against corruption in our hearts, but not everyone chooses that path. Let us remain patient. Perhaps some will notice that our companions avoid these vices and find contentment in simpler, honest living. Eventually, the commotion died down, and the caravan carried on. But the friction reminded Magomed that wherever people gathered, city, village, or open desert, there existed the potential for both goodness and harm. Surah 447 came to mind yet again. How it warned people not to pretend ignorance once moral clarity had presented itself. Many of these men likely knew better than to exploit gambling or theft, yet they pushed aside that inner voice for short-term gains. Magomed could only pray that, in time, some would rediscover their conscience. Weeks into the journey, they reached a remote caravanserai perched on the edge of a rocky plateau. This establishment was smaller than the one where Magomed's band had joined Fayez, but it served as a crucial stop for replenishing water and negotiating tolls to pass through certain tribal territories. Tall braziers lit its central courtyard at night, casting flickering light on ancient stone walls etched with travelers' names and cryptic symbols. Camels crowded together near troughs. Dust-laden men and women shuffled under archways to rent cots or find warm meals. There was an air of hushed expectancy, as though the place knew it was a final outpost of civilization before the wild frontiers beyond. Magomed and Rashid, finishing their work for the day, were about to settle down for supper when a stranger approached. A slender man with carefully manicured beard and a robe of fine, dark cloth. Gold-threaded trim adorned his sleeves, marking him as someone of wealth or influence. His manner radiated quiet confidence. Bowing slightly, he addressed them politely. "Peace be upon you. Are you the travelers who assist with Fayez's caravan?" "Yes," Magomed replied guardedly. "May peace be upon you as well. How can we help?" The stranger smiled. "My name is Abdullah. I've heard rumors that a man among Fayez's hires speaks of the Qur'an in a way that captivates hearts. Some say he has soothed disputes, aided the sick. I'm curious to learn more. Are you that man?" A tremor of caution ran through Magomed. He sensed both sincerity and potential risk in Abdullah's inquiry. Exchanging a glance with Rashid, he nodded. "I share verses when asked, nothing more. We simply try to live by our faith." Abdullah's eyes glimmered with interest. "I'd like to hear from these verses, particularly Surah 447, which I overheard someone mention. Could you spare a bit of time to discuss it?" Magomed hesitated. The request was direct, reminiscent of how his troubles began in the city. But something about Abdullah's demeanor suggested genuine curiosity rather than malicious intent. After a moment, Magomed inclined his head. "We can speak, yes. Let's find a quiet corner." They relocated to a recessed area near a half-finished stone wall, where flickering torchlight painted shadows on worn bricks. Rashid stood at a respectful distance, watchful. Abdullah leaned against the wall, arms folded, awaiting explanation. In a measured tone, Magomed recited the verse from Surah 447, carefully shaping the Arabic words so they resonated in the still air. Then, he offered a simple translation and commentary. It calls upon those who have been given scripture, those who know of revelation, not to turn away once the truth has come to them. It warns that ignoring or distorting that truth invites grave harm to one's own soul. We interpret it as a reminder that faith is an ongoing commitment, not a one-time declaration. Once you recognize moral guidance, turning away is an act of self-denial. Abdullah listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Magomed finished, he asked quietly, "Have you encountered many who turned away, despite knowing better?" Memories flooded Magomed's mind. The city officials, corrupt merchants, the betrayal that forced them into exile. "Yes," he replied, voice tinged with sadness. "It happens when pride or greed eclipses conscience. But I believe redemption is always possible, so long as a person's heart still stirs when they hear the call to righteousness." Abdullah nodded, as if weighing each word. Then he glanced around, ensuring no eavesdroppers, and lowered his voice. I come from a place where certain leaders also distort religion for their gain. I've grown disillusioned, yet part of me still yearns to see the Quran lived with sincerity. When I heard rumors about you, I wondered if you might be a messenger of that very sincerity. Magomed felt a mix of humility and alarm. The idea of being considered a messenger was dangerously reminiscent of the accusations leveled against him in the city. I'm only a man who's trying to uphold what we've been taught, he said carefully. If you sense sincerity, it's only because I cling to the Quran's moral teachings rather than any hidden agenda. A small smile curved Abdullah's lips. If more men approached faith with that humility, we might not see so much hypocrisy. Listen, I'm traveling east as well, though not with Fayez. My father controls a trade route near the coast. We have some influence in that region, enough perhaps to protect those seeking refuge. If you and your companions tire of constant flight, you might consider journeying with me once we leave this caravanserai. This offer startled Magomed. And if it invites the wrath of those who pursue us? Abdullah shrugged, the gold thread on his robe catching the torchlight. Let me worry about that. My father's domain might not be vast, but it's recognized. We keep our own guard. We also have scholars open to sincere exploration of faith. If you wish to speak freely of the Quran without fear of arrest, it could be a suitable haven. Rashid, who had been listening, stepped forward. We're grateful, but we've learned to be cautious. Forgive me if I ask, why extend such generosity to strangers? Abdullah exhaled, placing a hand over his heart. My reasons are personal. Let's say I've witnessed enough corruption in my homeland to know we need fresh voices, people who can rekindle faith, not politicize it. When I heard talk of a teacher who recites Surah 447 and helps unify hearts, I was intrigued. For now, let me simply say the invitation stands. If you prefer to remain with Fayez, that's your choice. Magomed looked at Rashid. They both recognized the gravity of this moment. An alternative path had presented itself, one that might lead to stable ground, where teaching could resume without immediate exile. Yet it could also be a trap or a complication. In the city, they had been lured by false offers before. Allow us time to discuss with our companions, Magomed said finally. We must make decisions as a group. Of course. Abdullah smiled again, warmth in his eyes. I plan to depart this caravanserai in 2 days. If you choose to join me, meet my retinue near the eastern gate at sunrise. If not, I wish you well on your journey. With that, he bowed politely and disappeared into the maze of tents and torches, leaving Magomed and Rashid standing in thoughtful silence. A swirl of desert wind ruffled their garments. That night, Magomed gathered his core companions around the dim glow of a single lamp. Layla clutched her child, who had finally drifted to sleep. Karim, tired from his day's labors, rubbed his eyes but listened intently. Rashid recounted Abdullah's offer, sparing no detail about the man's apparent sincerity. It could be an answer to our prayers, Layla said softly. To find a place where the child can grow without constant fear. It sounds too good to be true. Karim frowned. Or it might be too risky. We know nothing of Abdullah's father or his domain. We could walk into a political hornet's nest. Rashid folded his arms. True, but continuing with Fayez's caravan only guarantees more of the same. Long roads, uncertain welcome, no real place to settle. If Abdullah's land truly tolerates open religious discourse, maybe we can finally rest. Magomed listened to their perspectives, heart heavy with the memory of broken hopes in the city and the village. We have 2 days to decide, he murmured. Let us pray for guidance. Surah 447 reminds us to remain true once we see the path. But how do we know which path is right, if we're blind to the future? No one could answer that. By the time they lay down to sleep, each was burdened by the enormity of the choice looming ahead. The following day, the caravanserai bustled with trade negotiations, donkey hoofbeats echoing on stone, and caravans coming or going in a swirl of dust. Fayez gave no sign that he suspected Magomed's group might leave his employment. He was too busy haggling over spice prices with a group of new arrivals. Magomed used the lull to discreetly gather information. He asked a few traveling merchants if they knew anything of Abdullah's father or the region he controlled. Some responded with half-remembered rumors of a coastal domain that maintained its own militia, rumored to be more liberal in religious matters than the stricter powers further inland. Others insisted that the family's alliances were uncertain. "They're no saints," one merchant said with a scowl, "but they pay well for loyalty." By nightfall, Magomed and the others were leaning toward acceptance. They reasoned that no place could be perfect, but at least Abdullah's invitation offered the possibility of a haven. If it turned dangerous, they could move on yet again, exhausting though that prospect was. That evening, as Magomed prepared for sleep in a corner of the caravanserai yard, his mind churned with anticipation. He felt the gentle tug of Surah 447 at his core, reminding him that knowledge of moral truth demanded decisive action. If they spent their entire lives fleeing, never planting seeds of faith anywhere, what use was their survival? He closed his eyes, praying for clarity. "O Lord, if this path leads to harm, shield us. If it leads to good, give us courage to walk it. We place our trust in you." He dozed off amid the distant clamor of travelers settling in. Beyond the wall, the desert stretched into the night, silent witness to all the caravans and pilgrims who had ever passed that way. At dawn on the appointed day, Abdullah stood by the eastern gate, accompanied by a small entourage of guards and camels loaded with finely crafted saddlebags. The rising sun silhouetted them in golden light. Magomed's group approached with minimal baggage, hearts pounding. Abdullah surveyed them. "You've chosen to come, then?" Magomed inclined his head. "We have. We hope your invitation was genuine." Abdullah's gaze flicked over Rashid, Layla, Karim, and the child. He nodded, satisfaction flickering in his expression. "We depart at once. Let us travel in peace, and may God guide us." They parted ways with Fayez's caravan that morning, offering hurried farewells. Fayez looked more perplexed than angry, though he muttered something about losing good workers. Within an hour, Magomed and his friends were on the road with Abdullah's smaller retinue, heading across a less-traveled route that wound through mountainous foothills. The landscape soon became more rugged, steep cliffs, narrow passes where caravans had to move in single file. The dryness of the desert gave way to stony outcrops, hinting at higher elevations ahead. Abdullah explained that his father's domain lay near a strip of coastline where fertile plains met the sea, shielded by a ring of mountains. This natural barrier, combined with shrewd alliances, had allowed them a measure of autonomy. Merchants from multiple regions visited the area for trade, and the local governor, Abdullah's father, had a reputation for balancing tradition with new ideas. As they traveled, Magomed remained quietly observant. He was grateful for Abdullah's courtesy, yet cautious about revealing too much. Over evening fires, Abdullah asked questions about Islam and the particular emphasis Magomed placed on moral sincerity. Rashid, sensing the potential for deeper trust, shared a bit about their flight from the city, though he avoided naming specifics or describing the conspirators. One night, Abdullah confided that he'd grown uneasy with how certain elites used religious authority to manipulate the masses. "Many times, I've seen religion used more as a weapon than a guide to compassion," he admitted, eyes reflecting the fire's glow. "My father tries to maintain a balanced approach, but powerful neighbors keep pressing him to adopt stricter or more self-serving policies. If you speak openly of the Quran's true essence, some might label you a threat. I'm hoping, though, that in our home, honest discourse can flourish." Hearing this, Magomed understood the complexity they were walking into. Any domain that tolerated diverse perspectives likely juggled delicate politics. "We don't seek to undermine legitimate authority," he explained. "We only strive to remind those who believe that turning away from moral truth harms themselves and society." Abdullah's lips curved in a thoughtful smile. "That might still ruffle feathers, but perhaps it's a risk worth taking." After many days winding through craggy passes, the group reached a vantage point overlooking a vast expanse of azure water, the sea. Below, a stretch of lush farmland unfurled, dotted with groves of date palms and occasional villages nestled between rolling hills. The salt-tinged breeze carried the promise of a gentler climate. Layla inhaled sharply, tears glistening in her eyes. "The sea! I've never seen it before," she whispered. Her child, perched on her hip, gazed at the sparkling water with wide-eyed wonder. Rashid and Karim exchanged looks of amazement. Their entire trek had been shaped by deserts and dusty cities. Now, the shimmering coastline felt like a sign that they had truly left the shadows of old persecution behind. Abdullah gestured grandly. "Welcome to my father's territory. The main city lies farther down the coast. We'll reach it in a couple more days, traveling along these foothills." The path descended into gentler terrain. As they approached the coast, the air turned more humid, mild breezes rustling through palm fronds. Villagers they passed wore light, colorful garments rather than the muted desert robes. Water from shallow wells flowed more abundantly, irrigating patches of farmland that sprouted grains and vegetables. Felt like a different world. By the second day near the shore, they could see a modest city in the distance. Turrets of a protective fortress rose near the harbor, where ships dotted the coastline, a mix of fishing vessels and merchant dhows. The city walls were constructed of sun-baked bricks, reinforced with stone blocks. Abdullah explained that the fortress was his father's seat of governance, originally built by an older dynasty to guard against pirate raids and banditry. They arrived at the city gates in the late afternoon. Guards dressed in polished breastplates saluted Abdullah upon recognizing him, then eyed Magomed's group curiously. Abdullah waved them off. "There with me," he said simply, leading the travelers into a bustling maze of streets. The architecture, whitewashed walls, ornate balconies, narrow alleys, contrasted sharply with the desert towns Magomed once knew. The scent of salt and fish from the nearby piers mingled with the aroma of spiced rice and roasted vegetables sold by street vendors. Abdullah guided them through winding lanes until they reached a large courtyard centered by a marble fountain. Tall palm trees provided shade, and an arched entry led to a well-maintained estate. "This is one of our residences," Abdullah explained. "Not the main citadel, but suitable for guests. You can rest here while I speak with my father about how best to introduce you." Servants appeared, greeting Abdullah with deep bows. At his direction, they showed Magomed's group to modest yet comfortable rooms surrounding a small inner garden. The child gaped at the sight of flowering shrubs and a tinkling waterfall, a garden so unlike the parched desert. For the first time in memory, they might sleep on beds rather than blankets spread on hard ground. That evening, they gathered in a private courtyard, partaking in a simple but nourishing meal provided by the household staff: stewed fish, fresh bread, dates, and a sweet, tangy tea. Layla could hardly contain her astonishment. Karim, in awe, gently pressed his hand against the smooth columns that lined the space. Even Rashid, usually stoic, admitted, "This is the most comfort I've known in a long while." Magomed looked around, a swirl of emotions in his chest. They had found respite, perhaps even a chance to reestablish a life free from immediate peril. But he also knew comfort could lull people into forgetting their mission. "Let's remain humble," he advised quietly. "We've seen how quickly fortunes can change. If God has led us here, it's for a reason beyond luxury." His companions nodded. They had tasted enough hardship to keep perspective. The next day, Abdullah summoned Magomed, Rashid, and Layla to meet his father at the main citadel, leaving Karim behind to tend the child. They traveled along a wide avenue that overlooked the sparkling sea, passing shops selling pearls, spices, and fabrics from distant lands. The citadel's gates stood open, guarded by men in embroidered tunics. Within the courtyard, soldiers practiced drills, and officials bustled about carrying scrolls or dispatches. Abdullah led them through a colonnaded passage into a grand receiving hall, its walls adorned with tapestries depicting maritime trade and past triumphs. At the far end, seated on an elevated platform, was a dignified man with streaks of gray in his neatly trimmed beard. He wore a robe that balanced authority with subtle elegance, and his posture suggested a man both accustomed to rule and mindful of appearances. He glanced up as they approached, and Abdullah bowed. "Father, these are the travelers I mentioned." Magomed and his companions, the ones who have a unique perspective on the Qur'an. I thought you'd like to meet them. The governor, Malik al-Safadi, as Magomed later learned, studied them carefully, sharp eyes taking in their modest clothes and travel-worn features. "Welcome," he said in a measured tone. "My son says you have endured much. I'd like to hear your story." Magomed, heart pounding, offered a respectful bow. "Thank you for receiving us. We fled persecution in another city, where some opposed our reminders that faith is not a tool for power but a guide for moral living. We've wandered ever since, seeking a place where we can live openly and share what we've learned from the Qur'an, particularly the warning in Surah 447 that those who receive the truth must not turn away." Governor Malik's gaze flicked to Abdullah. "And you believe their account?" Abdullah inclined his head. "I've traveled with them, father. They show sincerity in deed as well as word. They are not agitators seeking to stir strife." The older man rose from his seat, descending a short flight of steps to meet them at eye level. He stood close enough that Magomed could sense the weight of his scrutiny. "I'll be direct. My domain tolerates varied views, but we keep the peace by balancing them carefully. If you disrupt that peace, I'll have no choice but to expel or detain you. Do you understand?" Magomed answered softly, "We have no desire to undermine legitimate order. We only wish to remind believers of the Quran's core call to justice and compassion. If that is subversive, then perhaps the question is why such a call is feared." A taut silence followed. Rashid tensed, concerned that Magomed's candor might anger this ruler. But a subtle shift passed across Malik's expression, part curiosity, part respect. He glanced at Layla, noticing the careworn lines of worry on her face, and perhaps recognized that this was no band of conspirators. Finally, Malik nodded. "Your words are bold, but so far I see no malice in them. I will permit you to stay under my son's sponsorship. Share your insights if people wish to listen, but do not incite rebellion. If trouble arises, we will revisit this arrangement." Abdullah exhaled, relief evident. Magomed bowed again. "We accept these terms with gratitude." Malik stepped back, retaking his seat. "Good. Abdullah, see that they have what they need. But keep me informed. The line between sincere teaching and fanaticism can be thin in these times." As they left the hall, Layla gripped Magomed's arm. "That was tense," she whispered. "But it could have been worse." Abdullah led them outside, a small smile hovering on his lips. "Father is cautious. He must be. We have neighbors waiting for any sign of weakness. But I suspect he found your honesty refreshing. Many men try to flatter or manipulate him. You, it seems, do neither." Rashid let out a breath. "So we can stay, then?" "Yes," Abdullah confirmed. "For now, you have a place here. But be mindful. Any rumor of sedition, and the goodwill could vanish." They made their way back to the estate, hearts still pounding with the aftertaste of confronting authority. Yet overall, a seed of hope took root. They had spoken plainly, and the door to living and teaching in this domain remained open. The memory of Surah 447 again sprang to Magomed's mind, an urging not to shirk responsibility when opportunity arose. The next few weeks passed in a surprising calm. Magomed and his companions settled into a modest routine within Abdullah's estate, helping with daily chores, exploring the city's markets, and discreetly sharing Quranic reflections with anyone who showed interest. Word began to spread, cautiously at first, that a teacher from distant lands was staying under the governor's roof, one who spoke of moral renewal within Islam. A few curious souls visited, some from the city's small circle of scholars, others just ordinary folk intrigued by whispers of a man who had survived great trials for his beliefs. Magomed, careful not to appear as though he was staging large gatherings, met them in the estate's garden or courtyard, often in small groups. He recited verses, explained their historical context, and emphasized that faith required sincerity and compassion rather than empty ritual. Layla sometimes quietly assisted, ensuring tea was served, her child playing with pebbles under the shade of a fig tree. Rashid and Karim contributed to logistical tasks, watching for any sign of official disapproval. Though the atmosphere was more tolerant than anywhere they had been before, Magomed remained aware of potential backlash. Some local clerics might resent an outsider teaching about the Qur'an. Some of Malik's advisors could see in Magomed's popularity a risk to the delicate balance of power. Yet day by day, no crackdown came. Instead, small anecdotes reached Magomed's ears. A man who decided to return borrowed money after hearing one of Magomed's parables, a young woman emboldened to protest an unjust local custom, or a merchant feeling pricked by conscience to treat his workers more fairly. One afternoon, while strolling through a quiet lane near the harbor, Magomed saw a fisherman kneeling to pray on the dock. The man rose and approached with tears in his eyes. "Teacher," he said, voice quavering, "I was told you recited Surah 447, urging us not to deny the truth. My father was once devout, but he died cursing religion because of hypocrisy he witnessed. I too nearly abandoned faith. But listening to your words, I sense maybe the problem was men, not God. I want to learn again. Is it too late?" Magomed's chest constricted with empathy. "It is never too late," he assured, resting a hand on the fisherman's shoulder. "The Quran calls us back to God's mercy, no matter how many times we've turned away. Your father's grievances might have been real, but that doesn't negate the eternal message of compassion and justice. I'm only a traveler, but I will share what I can if you wish." That evening, the fisherman joined a small circle at Abdullah's estate, listening raptly to recitations and quietly weeping when Magomed spoke of the Prophet's patience in Mecca, how even the hardest hearts sometimes softened upon recognizing genuine truth. In moments like these, Magomed felt a sense of fulfillment unlike anything he'd known since his earliest days by the sea. Here, in a place he never expected to find, the calling that once endangered him now found a cautious acceptance. Of course, not everyone welcomed the newcomer's message. A faction of older clerics in the city grumbled that the governor's son had brought an unknown teacher who might sow confusion among the faithful. They muttered that Magomed came from questionable origins, possibly influenced by heretical sections. Some advised Governor Malik to expel him before his presence stirred unrest. Malik, however, refrained from immediate action, trusting Abdullah's judgment. Yet tension simmered. Rumors flared that Magomed's teachings contradicted certain local customs. Others whispered that he secretly plotted to dethrone the governor and establish some radical form of rule. Though baseless, such rumors found fertile ground among those fearful of any change. Abdullah warned Magomed about the growing mutterings. "A few powerful families resent my father's more open-minded stance," he explained. "They exploit any perceived threat to the status quo. Your popularity among some common folk alarms them. They see how the fisherman or the spice merchant might question old hierarchies if they embrace a direct relationship with divine truth, rather than deferring to local clerics." Magomed sighed, recalling how quickly a similar pattern had emerged in the city he fled. "We can be mindful. I have no intention of undermining local leaders. But if telling people not to abandon the truth is seen as subversive, what does that say about those leaders?" Abdullah gave a humorless laugh. "It says they profit from ignorance. Yet my father tries to walk a line. I'll do my best to shield you, but please tread gently." Rashid, overhearing, clenched his fist. "Always treading gently. Sometimes it feels like we're betraying the message by not shouting it from the rooftops. But I suppose survival demands caution." Despite caution, there were uneasy signs that the honeymoon period might end. One night, Magomed discovered hateful graffiti scrawled on a garden wall. "False teacher, begone." The next morning, a servant reported that a stranger had demanded to see Magomed, ranting incoherently about foreign sorcery. Although the guards turned him away, it underscored that not everyone valued an open exchange of ideas. Still, daily life proceeded. Layla found solace in the estate's safer environment, watching her child play in the courtyard. Kareem lent a hand in the city's kitchens, refining his knowledge of local spices. Rashid used his strength to assist with chores or sometimes accompanied Abdullah on errands around the harbor. Magomed continued receiving visitors who sought spiritual guidance, always mindful that each conversation could ignite suspicion. Then came another twist. A formal invitation arrived at the estate, sealed with the insignia of the local religious council, a body of clerics who advised the governor on spiritual matters. The note requested Magomed's presence at a convened session to discuss his teachings. It was not couched in hostile terms, but the subtext was plain. They wanted to evaluate him, or perhaps corner him into renouncing any dangerous doctrines. Rashid's face darkened as he read the message. "It's just like before," he muttered, remembering the city's officials who had summoned Magomed under false pretenses. "Are they trying to trap you?" Abdullah studied the seal, worry etched on his brow. "The council is influential, but not all of them are fanatics. Some might simply want clarity about your views. Others could intend to build a case for expulsion. My father's stance is that if you can demonstrate you're no threat, the council might back down." Magomed felt a twinge of dread. Yet part of him believed that a public forum might also be an opportunity to express the true essence of Surah 447. If these clerics were sincere in safeguarding the faith, perhaps they would see that urging people to heed the Qur'an was not heretical. Still, memory of the city's tension gnawed at him. He prayed, pondering the example of the Prophet Muhammad, who faced repeated councils and debates in Mecca and Medina. Ultimately, standing for truth required facing scrutiny. With measured resolve, he decided to accept. "We'll go," he told Abdullah, "but we must prepare carefully." The day of the council session arrived under a haze of apprehension. Layla asked Magomed if he was sure, trembling with the recollection of how official summons in the past led to danger. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "If I hide, they'll assume guilt. If I speak openly yet humbly, perhaps hearts will soften. Pray for us." And so, accompanied by Rashid and Abdullah, Magomed made his way to the grand hall where the council met, a domed structure near the city's main mosque. Sentries eyed them but let them pass. Inside, a semicircle of robed clerics waited, their expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical. Governor Malik sat to one side, arms folded, maintaining a neutral air. A handful of onlookers, local notables, scholars, and even a few courtiers, observed from benches. A tall, stern-faced cleric rose, gesturing for Magomed to stand at the hall's center. "We've heard many accounts of your teachings," the man intoned. "We appreciate that you come voluntarily. We wish to clarify certain matters, to ensure no heresy or sedition grows under the guise of piety. Do you accept our authority to question you?" Magomed bowed respectfully. "I accept that you have a responsibility to safeguard the faith of this region. I'm prepared to answer truthfully." So began an hours-long examination. The clerics asked about the nature of Surah 447, about the hadiths Magomed cited to emphasize compassion. Some questioned whether he challenged the necessity of local scholars, suspecting him of encouraging laypeople to interpret scripture on their own. Others demanded to know his stance on the governor's authority, fearful that his calls for moral accountability might undermine governance. Magomed responded with measured calm. He explained that Islam's rich tradition included scholarship and also personal reflection, that the Prophet encouraged believers to think deeply rather than blindly follow. He insisted that he recognized legitimate governance, so long as it upheld justice and did not muzzle the core message of the Qur'an. He repeated Surah 447 in Arabic and offered a commentary. "God warns us not to turn our backs once we have knowledge. That is not a license for rebellion, but a reminder to be sincere servants of the divine moral law." At intervals, some clerics nodded gravely, seemingly appeased. Others frowned, perceiving a threat to their interpretive monopoly. Governor Malik watched in silence, occasionally exchanging glances with Abdullah. Tension spiked when a particularly rigid cleric accused Magomed of leading naive souls astray by encouraging them to question established customs. Magomed calmly replied, "I only invite believers to ensure that custom aligns with the Qur'an's justice. If it does, there is no conflict. If it doesn't, should we remain silent?" The debate continued into the afternoon, testing Magomed's patience. Yet he recalled the Prophet's example, how unwavering courtesy and clarity often diffused hostility. Rashid, standing behind him, quietly prayed for a peaceful resolution. Abdullah, too, watched anxiously, aware that a single misstep could provoke condemnation. As the sun dipped lower, the lead cleric raised his hands. "We have heard enough. Let us confer." The council members withdrew to a side chamber, leaving Magomed and the others in uneasy suspense. Whispers spread among the onlookers, some praising Magomed's eloquence, others calling him reckless. After a tense wait, the clerics returned. Their leader declared that while they found no outright heresy in Magomed's words, they remained cautious about his potential to stir unrest if misused by unscrupulous elements. Thus, they would not forbid him from teaching, but they placed him under a form of watchful oversight. Should any complaint of sedition arise, the council would revisit its judgment. Governor Malik nodded, relief flickering across his face. Abdullah exhaled. Magomed bowed once more. "I accept these terms, trusting that sincerity and transparency will show our intentions." And so he walked out of the hall, neither condemned nor fully embraced, a precarious victory reminiscent of his earlier experiences. Yet it was a far better outcome than immediate exile or arrest. Rashid clapped him on the shoulder once they were outside, a weary grin on his lips. "You did it. The council didn't lock you up." Magomed smiled, exhaustion etched in his features. "Yes, but the real test is how we proceed from here. We must be wise, but we must also remain true to the message. Let us not turn away in fear." Abdullah, standing beside them, nodded. "A delicate balance, but I believe you can manage it." My father, at least, seemed mollified. They made their way back through the city's winding streets, the ocean breeze carrying distant calls of seagulls. Passing fishermen, spice vendors, and curious bystanders glanced at Magomed's small entourage. Some recognized him as the traveler teacher, offering nods or half-smiles. In the hush of early evening, every step felt like a milestone in a much longer journey, one that had begun in a distant coastal village and wound through desert storms, city betrayal, and reluctant acceptance in a foreign domain. Reaching Abdullah's estate at dusk, they found Layla and Kareem waiting anxiously. Learning the outcome, Layla broke into a relieved smile. Kareem offered a prayer of thanks, tears glinting in his eyes. "So we remain here?" he asked. Magomed nodded, voice quiet with equal parts relief and caution. "Yes, we have an opening to continue teaching, to keep living the moral truths we cling to. But we must do so under watchful eyes. Let us not waste the opportunity." Surah 447 calls us not to abandon what we've learned, and we have learned that sincerity can survive, even in the face of official scrutiny. That night, the estate's courtyard was filled with a subdued joy, no raucous celebration, but a gentle glow of hope that they could plant deeper roots. They had arrived, for once, at a place that might let them stay, as long as they remained prudent and unwavering in their sincerity. Magomed lingered by the garden fountain after the others retired. The moonlight illuminated cascading water, the ripples shimmering like small silver coins on the surface. He recited Surah 447 under his breath, letting each syllable flow with the burble of the fountain. This, he reflected, was a testament to how far they had come, that after so many storms, so much persecution, they could stand in a serene courtyard and proclaim the same verse openly. The memory of the city's cruelty still weighed on him, and the haunting echoes of potential enemies lingered. But in this moment, he felt gratitude overshadow fear. He placed a hand on the fountain's cool stone, inhaling the scent of night-blooming flowers. Day by day, God's mercy had led them forward. Every step threatened adversity, but each challenge had also revealed new depths of faith. Perhaps in this coastal domain, they would help souls rediscover the truth that hypocrisy had nearly buried. Perhaps here, the ancient call of the Qur'an could shine with renewed clarity, guiding hearts to stop turning away from what they already knew was right. Closing his eyes, Magomed whispered a single prayer into the moonlit air. "O Lord, keep us steadfast, so that the truth we've found in your words may not wither under worldly pressures. Let us heed your reminder and never again turn our faces from the revelation, no matter the cost." And in the hush of that coastal night, with the sea murmuring beyond the city walls. It felt as though the entire universe nodded in silent agreement.